Great. Well, welcome to the January meeting, the first meeting of 2023 of the Housing Advisory Board. This is our second hybrid meeting with our board members here in person and members of the public and some others zooming in. And we have a really cool agenda tonight and some good guest speakers, but we will start by calling this meeting to order and having a roll call. So Board Member Terry Pamos. Here. Julianne Ramsey.
Here.
Philip Ogren. Here. Annie Teodoro. Not here, but on his way. We have a quorum, so we will get started. I'll remind everybody of our rules of public comment. We're grateful for everyone who's attending, tonight's meetings. And we want to keep this meeting fully transparent as we're required to do, even in a virtual meeting. I remind you that the chat function can only be used to ask the host technical questions about the Zoom platform. Please refrain from chatting to staff or board members about the content of the meeting. If there is disruption in the meeting, our guests will be warned, and we hope we're going to take the step of removing anyone from the meeting. So with that, we'll review tonight's agenda. That's item number 2 on the agenda. We'll be approving the minutes. We'll have public participation in just a minute or two with open comment, limited to 3 minutes. Matters from the board. We'll be getting an update on ADUs with a study session memo that's attached in the packet. We'll be hearing from Lisa Hood, our senior city planner, on this topic. We'll have a board member discussion on zoning for affordable housing, sort of a new topic for us, a big one. And this will basically be a brainstorming session with feedback. And I don't think we'll be voting on any recommendation or any matter. That we'll have a good discussion on that. And then we'll be continuing to solicit ideas for listening sessions that we would like to get back to hosting, preferably in person in 2023. So that's matters from the board. Item 5, item 6, matters from staff. We'll be hearing a preview of next week's joint meeting with planning board on inclusionary housing 101. We'll do a debrief close to 9 o'clock and a calendar check and adjourn during the meeting at 9 p.m. So with that, any questions before I ask for a motion to approve the December 2022 meetings? And I got a motion on that? Second? Okay, all in favor? Aye. The minutes of December 7th, 2022 are approved. Do we have any members of the public zooming in who would like to take time to comment to the board?
Yep, there's several.
Yeah, also, Michael, if you could just let the public know that the chat function is disabled.
Oh,
But the Q&A is available to communicate with.
Q&A, is that on Zoom also?
Yeah, I'm taking care of the queue.
Okay, so our chat function is disabled. I assume that's a technical issue that we're not able to solve right away. There is a Q&A function also in the Zoom that is available. And of course, people can comment live now if we have anybody in the waiting room that would like to comment.
Yep. So first up, we have Lynn.
And Lynn Siegel. Welcome, Lynn.
Of course, I am furious that I was ejected from the last meeting. I want to let you know that I don't have a video window to activate tonight, Michael. I do not have one. When I go to 5 or 10 Zooms a day, and I activate my video all the time, except in the winter, because I'm 40 degrees. I'm very cold in my home because I can't afford XL's excessive rate case. And so it's tough for me when I'm ejected from a meeting, when I'm trying to cover 4 different meetings at the same time, or maybe it was 3 other meetings, 3 or 4. I'm jumping between meetings. I depend, for one, on being able to access the meeting at all, which I couldn't for the previous hour. And I detailed and I put everything. I spent hours and hours detailing every minute of everything that happened and watched the meeting afterwards. And I heard the Elizabeth, or whatever her name was, ask, "Oh, Lynn has a question." And you, Michael, totally ignored her. and went on to say, if you ever want to come to Boulder, you know, you can see what affordable housing is like here and blah, blah, blah. You didn't even listen to your own presenter. And I get it that maybe you just don't like me over the years or what have you, but you can't express yourself, your dislike for me in this way. You cannot do that, not with my approval. And I hope the public's approval also, because I didn't see anything that said, I can't turn my video window on or I will be ejected from the meeting without warning. That is so not okay. My timer, I'm getting more and more time. That's great because I didn't get any time last time. And then I was told, at one point in the meeting, you said, oh, that's Lynn, you know, you kind of talked to Jane, said, well, she missed public comment. No, I didn't miss public comment. You never had public comment because you didn't have the public there for the first hour of the meeting. You did not have them there. Well, this is a big deal because housing is everything. All over the world, housing is everything. And right now with Papelios, it's a disaster what's going to happen there. And it was just rezoned to MU3, which allows them a penthouse, 4 stories, and a swimming pool that none of the affordable housing people can swim in, right? Well, I have a friend that that works with me on plutonium issues, and he happens to live in Hayden Apartments or Hayden Place or something. And he's living in a hotel right now, courtesy of me and the city of Boulder, because the person in the downstairs of this Boulder Housing Partners facility had diapers from years and years left, and the place had to be evacuated because of feces. This is what Boulder Housing Partners produce, you know. And Aaron Brockett goes and says, "Oh, geez, we are not segregated community. We're integrated all over, you know, the district 30th and Pearl and all. This is all integrally related to the rest of Boulder." No, it's not. There are people, and I've heard hours and hours over you know, a long period of time of people testifying of how miserable their existence is in some of this quote unquote affordable housing in Boulder, how they don't feel safe, how their kids are not safe, etc. And the more you have a wealth inequity in this community, the worse this problem's going to get. So something needs to change.
I'm sorry, Lynn, I think your time is up now.
Okay, and what you need to do is stop funding the developers. Stop subsidizing them. Sorry about that, Terry, but that's the way it is. It's all, when we all do better, we all do better. Done.
Well, thank you for your comments. I assure you that it's nothing personal to your comment, and but we always appreciate it when you are able to come and offer your ideas to Pat. So thank you.
Can I say something?
Do we have, sure.
Lynn, can you hear me?
He's muted.
Oh, so you can hear me?
She can hear you.
Happy New Year, Lynn. Oh, Happy New Year.
Next, we have Mark.
Mark Fearer, would you like to take your 3 minutes for public comment? Welcome to our HAB meeting.
Yes, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, happy Lunar New Year to you all. I wasn't going to participate tonight. Some of you may recall that I have spoken several times to HAB before on the subject of rent control. And honestly, I've been hopeless about the issue until lately. And in fact, I just got done reading an article in the Denver Post about the repeal of rent control legislation being introduced in the House, Colorado House, and it sounds like it has a good chance of passage. In the article that I read in the Denver Post, it said that the Colorado Municipal League had not received any comment from any city supporting this issue of repealing rent control, which repealing the ban on rent control, I should say. And it surprises me because my understanding is that the city of Boulder has supported at least several times in the past to repeal that ban. Now, I don't know if that has been going through Colorado Municipal League. I know the city has a person who's a liaison with the CML, but at the very least, and that's why I'm on here tonight, I would really like to urge HAB to advise the city council to strongly lobby or support CML's efforts to support this repeal of the rent control. And I could talk a lot more about rent control in general, but that's my main message tonight. If I would love to see HAB take a more active position on supporting tenant issues. I'm certainly aware that you support affordable housing, and I really appreciate that. And I work with the Resident Representative Council of BHP, and I really appreciate the city's commitment to affordable housing. But rent control is the ultimate and best way to support all renters in Boulder. And I would really like to see HAB, again, advise the city council to please make it clear to CML that they do support this repeal, this legislation for repealing it. And I'll leave it there for now, unless you have any questions.
What's CML again?
Colorado Municipal.
Colorado
League.
Municipal.
Yeah,
Thank you for those comments.
I can provide a quick update. If
Oh,
that's helpful.
absolutely, absolutely.
So Mark, thanks for bringing that up. So I just heard about it for the first time, and I know that council is going to discuss it tomorrow night as part of their legislative agenda. But the reason you haven't heard much is because it is so new, but I was going to share that with the rest of the HAB later on tonight as well.
Great. Mark, I appreciate your comments. HAB does have a work plan that is largely focused on missing middle income housing, but and that's not to say that other housing issues aren't important, but we only have so much time. We did have to focus on something important. We did address a segment of the rental issue by supporting ADU reform that would allow a real increase, we think, in the availability of ADUs, which are has been shown statistically to be an affordable housing type that would easily provide in greater capacity. So we could possibly do a listening session on the issue of rentals and rental issues. We have it on the agenda to talk about future listening sessions tonight, and we'll bring that up and we'll discuss it. So thank you.
We have Lisa Spalding.
Okay, is anyone? Oh, Lisa Spalding, welcome.
Lisa Spalding, representing the University Hill Neighborhood Association on ADU reform. University Hill has a complicated zoning history that most people are unaware of. It impacts a delicate balance between permanent residents who have been raising their families on the Hill for generations and students who occupy the many rentals dispersed throughout the neighborhood. Permanent residents create stability and ensure a measure of safety for students who are living on their own for the first time in their lives. When zoning was introduced in Boulder in 1928, the blocks south of Aurora were zoned single-family residential, and they have remained that way ever since, despite a number of subdivided single-family homes slipping past the city staff. In the mid-1970s, medium-density blocks of the Hill south of College and west of 16th were downzoned to low density in an effort to guarantee a balance between family homes and student rentals. Unfortunately, the city grandfathered everything in without a sunset date, and investors have taken advantage of the very loose enforcement of the use it or lose it stipulation. Non-conforming uses count toward the ADU saturation limit, and the large number of legal non-conforming properties on the Hill already places a huge strain on many blocks. For example, the 800 block of 11th Street has a sorority with an occupancy of 109, a triplex across the street from it with 9 legal residents, and the soon-to-be-completed high-end student apartment complex across the alley from the sorority, which will have an occupancy of 48. The population density of the hill is much higher than it appears on a zoning map, and the saturation limit is the only tool Boulder has that prevents adverse effects that could overwhelm our already dense neighborhood. We won't quibble with the assertion that Boulder is the only city in the country with limits on the number of ADUs, although we have found other examples, because the pertinent fact is that if the tool is eliminated, it must be replaced with something else that will preclude population growth that exceeds the carrying capacity of our neighborhood. The city has stated that the Code Enforcement Division is currently fully staffed, but they are only investigating over occupancy when it involves violations that threaten health and safety of renters. If saturation limits are lifted, we doubt that the current staff will be able to proactively enforce the proper use of ADUs. Student rentals are extremely lucrative and investors are adept at skirting rules. We do not object to ADUs, but we share concerns about the proposed changes with other neighborhoods surrounding the university and hope to meet with staff to discuss alternatives to the one-size-fits-all approach before a final draft ordinance is written. We would also like to thank the chair for his kind reply to our email. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think everyone saw the letter from the University Hill neighbors. It was very well stated. We appreciated you sending it. And I understand the problems on the Hill. I have friends that live up there and visit often. And, you know, I agree there's some problems that need to be solved there. Issue for council to grapple with when they come to terms with ADU reform is how do you work? Is it possible to exempt areas that have certain stresses? I don't know the answer to that. You know, it can be, it can open the gates to unintended consequences when you do that. You know, everybody wants the exemption in every neighborhood, for example. So I'm hoping that our political leaders, as they parse our recommendations, if they do indeed enact ADU reform, will be able to do something that will help improve the situation on the Hill, make it a more livable neighborhood. And again, I would just like to say we hear you, and I don't really know what the answers are, but the points you raised are very well. One slight point of clarification is I don't think anyone had ever stated there were no communities with saturation limits. It was just the peer city study groups that city staff presented to us. But I believe it was 34 communities, but it was interesting to have that brought to our attention. So thank you for doing that. Anyone have any other comment? Okay, do we have any other members of the public who would like to comment?
There's no other hands raised.
Great, we appreciate members of the public coming to share their ideas. That brings us to item 5, matters from the board. We're going to get an update from Lisa Hood, our senior state planner. It's pronounced Hood, right?
That's correct.
Okay, good. But on the ADU regulations update, very pertinent to our last comment. So with that, I think I can turn it over to Lisa. She will give us information.
All right, thank you, Chair. And thanks for the correct pronunciation. It's often mispronounced, so.
Let's see if you can get mine.
I think I got it. Lucchese?
Pretty close.
Pretty close?
Yes.
What is it?
Lucchese, if you're in Italy.
Lucchese. Okay, well, yeah, mine's French, so it would be oud technically,
Oh,
but.
okay. Go with that.
All right. Well, it's nice to see you all. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I was really looking forward to it, but I am fighting off a cold and figured no one really wanted me around them with this cold. So I will try to make the best of this hybrid environment and glad to have this opportunity to still be able to speak with you about accessory dwelling units. So we were last here back in September and chatted with you about the evaluation we were working on, the ADU survey that we had done. And since then, back in November, we met with council and really determined what the scope of this ADU change and code update is going to be. So the focus tonight is to talk about those items on the scope of work that council approved. Just some basics when we're talking about ADUs. I know you guys are very familiar, but for Anyone else who might be listening, when we talk about ADUs in Boulder, it's really a small residence sharing a lot with a larger main house. So these graphics, I think, are helpful to show that we have both an attached ADU style, which could be like an apartment unit in a attic or basement or attached to the house, or the detached ADU, which is always in a separate structure. But it's important to know that an ADU is an independent and self-contained living space. So it always has a kitchen and bathroom, things like that. We talked at great length. I gave you a lot of data points back in September, so I won't go through all of those again, but just some of the main points that ADUs have been allowed in Boulder since 1983. So we're at our 40-year anniversary now. They have to be located on a lot with an owner-occupied single-family home, single-family home. So that the owner can live either in the ADU or the main house, but they do have to live on the lot. We have about 450 ADUs in the city right now. And as we talked about in September, we did a study from the point when the last major update went into effect, which was early 2019 through kind of mid last year, on the size, type, and affordability of ADUs. And what we saw was we had 200 ADUs get approved in that time. About 2/3 were that detached style, a third being the attached. The average size was about 640 square feet. And you can see it differs based on detached and attached style. And then in those last updates, we also introduced a new concept of an affordable ADU. So that's an ADU that is rented for no more than 75% of the area median income. And of those 200 applications, we saw about a third of those applications come in as the affordable ADUs. And the affordable units get some flexibility in size and parking. So that was part of the ADU regulations update back in 2018.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want us asking questions as we go?
Yeah, go
Or-
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
So that 67 affordable, that's affordable designated?
So it's meeting that limit that we set of 75% area median income. And they have to attest to it being affordable in the declaration of use with the accessory dwelling unit. So that's how we confirm that it's an affordable unit.
Okay. Do you know how many of the 133 market rate would qualify as affordable or are kind of in fact market rate affordable?
Yeah, that was interesting. So part of that survey, which you can dig into in the packet, we asked the ADU owners to say what they were renting their ADUs for, and the average rent, both market rate and affordable combined, was about $1,600. So that's, you can see this small text on the bottom that the 75% AMI for a 1-bedroom would be $1,700. So regardless of being officially affordable or not, we're seeing those rents being lower than that affordable limit.
So more than half?
Oh.
You know, the data, yeah, the data wasn't perfect in that ADU owner survey because not all of them answered that question. So I don't know that I rely on that data perfectly, but I think it gives us a good idea just as an average.
So Lisa, in terms of that average, that was for just for 1-bedrooms you're looking at? I mean, are there, I imagine there's probably not too many 2-bedrooms, but.
Yeah, we actually didn't differentiate by bedroom. So, but I don't think there are very many 2-bedroom ADUs because of the size limit.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some limitations to the survey. It's been helpful because we've done it 2012, 2017, and 2022 to have those same questions. But obviously, as our ADU regulations have gotten more refined, the survey isn't quite as refined anymore.
Lisa, I have a question, relates to the earlier comment about rent control. Affordable ADUs, would that be an example of what you might call voluntary rent control? Because the homeowner agrees to do it.
Yeah, I'd probably look to Jay as the housing expert to answer that one, but
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the fact that they're agreeing to it voluntarily means it's not a requirement.
Right.
So they're getting something in exchange for that, which is typically the larger size, not having to provide a parking space, things like that.
And private developer doing a tax credit project, is that also an example of what you might call voluntary rent control? Because they're agreeing to stabilize the rates for a period of time, right?
I would say that's more regulatory because if they, to be eligible for the tax credits, they must follow will lose their tax credit deal if they don't
Right.
rent at the rents that they promise.
It is effectively rent control, it just doesn't apply across.
Exactly. If you want tax credits, yes, you
Right.
must follow their rules.
Okay, but just raise the point that there are rent controlled apartments in Boulder. Just maybe not as many as we'd like. Lisa, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, feel free to interrupt. I have quite a few background slides, so if you have any questions, and then I've kind of organized the rest of the presentation by the questions in the memo. So that's kind of what's in store for you for the rest of this. So the next slide, I just wanted to kind of compare and bring you through the process of how the scope of work for this project. So City Council originally identified this as one of their priority projects for their work plan last year, and with the objective to increase the allowance of ADUs in the community. The initial direction that staff got was to look at removing the saturation limit, look at allowing both an attached and detached ADU on one lot, and then to do this analysis of the potential barriers to construction. And so that really led into that evaluation that I was talking about, where we did data analysis, internal stakeholder interviews, the survey I mentioned, and even interviewed the applicants who withdrew their applications for ADUs. After we talked to you all in September, you submitted a recommendation to City Council for these 6 items, which some of it overlaps. So eliminating the saturation limit, but also eliminating parking requirements and minimum lot sizes, as well as revising ADU size limits, creating the pre-approved floor plans, and streamlining the ADU review process. And after we went through the entire evaluation, just based on, and I'll talk about this in later slides too, but based on what we saw made a significant impact over the last few years, this is what staff recommended to City Council, and they agreed with to focus on for these ADU changes, with the caveat that we would maintain a list of future changes to ADUs, future amendments that could be made to further reduce barriers. But for this discrete project, focusing on these 4 items. So eliminating the saturation limit, modifying the size limits as you all had recommended, and then also perhaps the method of measurement, which is something we ran into with the evaluation. And then also one of your recommendations, the clarifying and simplifying the regulations and improving the overall processes. So at this time, part of the scope doesn't include the parking requirements or minimum lot size that you all had recommended, but it's definitely on the list for future ADU reform for us to consider. The plan for engagement for this project, we're trying to rely a lot on the engagement that was done with the last update, because there was a significant amount of engagement done at that time, which talked about a lot of these similar issues. So there's a lot there that we can still use to inform these future changes. So we asked questions at that time in 2018 about saturation and size, and I'll get into those on later slides as well, what we heard. But it's still a lot of really helpful and relevant info. We also went to our community connectors and residents program. That's a really great group of people that are kind of representing underrepresented groups in Boulder and providing a diverse variety of perspectives on issues. So we had a great conversation with them about ADUs, which I'll also talk about later. We went to planning board last week. The asterisks on the slide indicate that that's somewhere where there's an open comment period where people are able to provide public comment verbally. And then we're here tonight at Housing Advisory Board, had our open comment right before this. We will go to City Council for a study session tomorrow to hear their input. They're actually going to get the exact same presentation that you're getting tonight. So that's what we'll be doing tomorrow. And then we'll go to the Board of Zoning Adjustment next month as well. We posted a Be Heard Boulder page. That's our online public engagement site where people can submit feedback virtually about how ADUs are working currently and any input on the changes, as well as just a clearinghouse for where people can find information about how to provide their input. We'll also do staff office hours where our staff is available for questions and answers with members of the public through February and March. And then we'll move into the actual ordinance review and the public hearings that go along with that in April and May. And so with all of this, we think that meets the consult level of engagement from our engagement plan. And I mentioned that we were looking at this engagement back from 2016 to 2018. This is just a summary of all of the kind of a quantitative summary of all the engagement done at that time. Some of the key community concerns that were heard at that time, which I think we've been hearing in some of the public comment that you would have seen in your attachments as well, are neighborhood nuisances, over occupancy, owner occupancy, illegal rentals, saturation, and affordability. Specifically related to that engagement, we did a questionnaire back in 2018 regarding proposed changes at the time. And so at the time, the proposal for the saturation limit was the increase from 10% to 20% for the saturation limit. And there were mixed opinions about whether that increase from 10% or 20% was supported. So about a third of people disagreed with raising the saturation limit. But on the other hand, there were many residents who were supportive of the increase, and even a percentage of those within the questionnaire indicated that they'd be supportive of going even further and eliminating the saturation limit. So if you're curious, there's a lot more in the packet provided with your agenda tonight, with all of the public input that was given at the time. There was another question about the size limit at that time. So in 2018, the original proposal was to change the allowable maximum size of ADUs from 450 square feet to 800 square feet for detached, and then to change it from a third or 1,000 square feet for an attached unit to a half. And at that time, a majority of the respondents were actually supportive of the change to half or 1,000 square feet for attached, but that wasn't ultimately adopted. So the attached unit is still limited to a third or 1,000. And then the detached was only increased to 550 at that time. We also had a community survey associated with the Boulder Valley Comp Plan in 2016, where we asked it was a statistically valid survey, where we asked 3 questions about kind of people's support for ADUs in existing established neighborhoods. And all 3 of those questions received majority support for allowing more ADUs at 62%. I mentioned we went to the community connectors in residence, and this is just a high level summary of the feedback. There's a more detailed summary in your packet as well. But our conversation really focused on the benefits and burdens of ADUs, which is one of the steps of the racial equity plan that Boulder has. And the community connectors were generally supportive of eliminating the saturation limit and increasing the size limit, but did want to make sure that that ADUs are truly providing housing for the people that need them, and that they would remain affordable for people in the city. They also had some great programmatic ideas related to Section 8 housing vouchers, programs that could provide funding assistance for first-time homebuyers, people of color, economically disadvantaged folks, to have assistance to construct an ADU so that more people are able to benefit from an ADU, as well as potentially reducing fees and things like that for ADUs. And they also noted that increasing the size limit of ADUs would make these types of housing units more suitable for families. We went to, like I mentioned, we went to planning board last week and also went over these kind of main changes. Planning board was generally supportive of the changes to simplify and clarify the code. And they were generally supportive of removing the saturation limit, but wanted to make sure that there were other ways to control the externalities of ADUs without a saturation limit, especially in the areas near the university. So those externalities would be things like parking, trash, noise. We also talked a bit about some concerns about ADUs actually raising the property values for those properties that have an ADU on them. And then there were some concerns raised that a smaller percentage of ADU owners are using the ADU for a long-term rental, which is something that we did see in the ADU owner survey results. And then there were also concerns about potentially eliminating the public notice for ADU applications. I can get into that more when we get into those specifics about the changes, but and then the planning board was also open to some changes to the size limit, but wanted there to be a logical reason for what that limit is. So that's the background that I have for you. I mentioned that I'll split this presentation up into these 3 questions that we had in the memo. So it's that kind of size limits, saturation limits, and then all the other clarification and simplification items. So I'll just jump into a little bit more summary about the evaluation before we get into the saturation limits. But if you remember talking about this in the 40-year history of ADUs over time, this chart shows how many ADUs were approved each year since 1983. You can see that big jump in 2019 when we after we last changed the ADU regulation. So it's really those 4 years past that we were analyzing to understand through the evaluation. And the evaluation conclusions basically were that the changes that were made in 2018 that we thought really reduced barriers for ADUs was the increase in saturation limit, the increase in maximum size, the decreased minimum lot size, and then the increased number of zoning districts. And of those, saturation limit and maximum size actually had the most impact, we thought. And then there were a number of other changes that we identified through the evaluation and all the work that we did, such as extending the approval expiration, providing some flexibility for height, and then general code clarification and process improvements that we thought would further reduce barriers to ADUs that came up during that evaluation process. So that's what really informed the recommended scope for the city council that we talked with them about in November. I've talked a bit about this ADU owner survey already, and the fact that it's a comparable survey over time, 2012 and 2017 as well. We had about half of owners respond, which is great. Some of the highlights, which I know our housing team can add to as well, but we are seeing a greater percentage of ADUs being used as space for either visitors or relatives, rather than as space used as a long-term rental. We asked people, this was a new question since affordable ADUs are a new concept, but we asked people of those, if you chose to do an affordable ADU, what was the reason for it? And about 40% of owners chose to do that to reduce the parking requirement, because that's an incentive offered for affordable ADUs. And then because that original scope with City Council had contemplated the idea of a second ADU, we asked if people would be interested in a second ADU, and over 3/4 said that they wouldn't be interested in pursuing that. Michael, you already talked about this comparable city research, so thanks for teeing this up. But we did also, as part of the evaluation and the research we've been doing to lead up into these code changes, is looked at 34 different cities around the country that are comparable in some way, whether it's being a university city, similar population size, similar population density, housing prices, things like that. And these are all cities that have ADU regulations. So there are also several that have commonly or recently updated their ADU regulations. But these are kind of the takeaways from that. None of these cities, the 34 cities, have a saturation limit for ADUs. This has been a little bit of a sticking point. We've been trying to find another city around the country that has a similar saturation limit. Certainly there are different ways that people or that cities will limit ADUs, whether that means completely prohibiting ADUs or only allowing them in certain zoning districts and not other districts. But this idea of a saturation limit in the way that Boulder does it is definitely quite unique. We actually just yesterday found one other town in the city or in the country that has it. It's a 20,000 person town in Connecticut. And then I did find some research that Seattle used to have a saturation limit, but repealed it at least in the 90s. So it's something that not many cities have in the same way that Boulder has, and none of those comparable cities have. And also of those 34 cities, only a few of them actually have a minimum lot size requirement. Almost all of these cities limit it to 1 ADU per lot. And Boulder's maximum size of detached ADUs in particular is smaller than most cities. Colorado tends to be on the smaller side, but it's still usually about 600 to 1,000. And so since we only allow 550, that's even on the small side for Colorado. Around the country, probably more typical is about 800 square feet for a detached ADU or a percentage of the principal structure. Regarding parking requirements, it's a bit more varied. Often it's either 0 or 1 parking space required. Some cities will waive it if the location is close to transit. Almost all of the comparable cities say that the ADU cannot be sold separately, and about half and half require owner occupancy where the owner has to live on site. So we've been using this to inform our future changes as well. This wasn't in your memo, but just because of the timeliness of Governor Polis's State of the State speech last week, where he talked a lot about housing priorities, and we had a planning board member request that this be included in the presentation. There are a number of states that have ADU legislation, especially a lot of changes in the last few years. So you may have heard of these, but California has been increasingly removing barriers and trying to streamline processes to expand potential capacity. Washington requires cities over a certain size to allow ADUs, same with Vermont, New Hampshire, Oregon. Oregon's interesting. Recently, they eliminated, they said that cities cannot have an owner occupancy requirement or off-street parking requirements for ADUs. Connecticut and Utah both have mandates to allow by right, but then allow cities to exempt either portions of their city or fully opt out of allowing ADUs. But we haven't looked at every single state, but this is just an idea, just because this is on the topic of housing. This is what's been going on in other states around the country recently. All right, so finally, these focus areas. I think I promised I was done with background and then I had some more background, so sorry about that. All right, again, the scope that City Council tasked us with are saturation limits, size limits, clarifying, and approval processes. So the saturation limit, I've already mentioned several times, and I believe that we talked about it last time, so you probably have an understanding, but the saturation limit that we have in Boulder only applies to the RL1 and RL2 zoning districts. Those are our low density residential zoning districts. And as I mentioned, the limit was increased from 10% to 20% back in 2018, went into effect in 2019. But essentially at its most simple explanation is that you draw a radius 300 feet around a property, and only 20% of those properties can have an ADU, a non-conforming duplex, a co-op, things like that. So we really simplified and said there were 10 properties in that 300-foot radius. Only 2 of those properties can have an ADU. So if you are the third owner in that area to want to do an ADU, you are not able to apply for or receive an ADU approval. We do maintain a waiting list for people that would want to develop an ADU if a neighbor were to remove their ADU. We have 12 properties on that list, and I don't believe we've had any ADUs removed in that time that those have been on there. So the saturation limit has been in place since 1983. It was in the original ADU regulations. So understandably at the time, Boulder was on kind of the forefront of ADUs being reintroduced into cities. They were certainly something that existed historically before single family zoning. But around the 80s, cities started to re-legalize ADUs, and Boulder was one of the early adopters of that. And so I think understandably at the time, there were concerns about what the impacts of allowing ADUs would be on established neighborhoods, but we're now 40 years into allowing ADUs. We have over 450 ADUs in the community. So we better understand what impacts and externalities the ADUs might have and how we can mitigate those. Most cities, as I mentioned, it's relatively rare to have a saturation limit like this. Most cities rely on their existing zoning standards related to form and bulk and design and location and things like that to mitigate any concerns about compatibility or impact. In the evaluation, since I mentioned we increased the saturation limit from 10 to 20%, we also tried to understand how many ADUs actually benefited from that increase. And of the 200 ADUs that we saw approved between 2019 and 2022, 41 of those, so that light green part of the pie, they actually had a saturation limit that was larger than 10%. So those 41 ADUs would not have previously been approved before those changes. But it's interesting to note that over 3/4 of the ADUs that were approved either are in a district that don't have a saturation limit, our higher density residential districts don't have any saturation limit, for instance, or they were already below 10% saturation. So it would have met the original regulation from before 2018 as well. The saturation limit is a challenge procedurally for both staff and the public to understand. These are, and I can't remember if I had these compiled by the time I saw you in September, but these are just some examples verbatim from our Inquire Boulder customer service portal of people asking about their saturation limit. It's something that the public or an applicant is not able to calculate for themselves. And so staff has to calculate those all individually. And what's unique about the saturation limit compared to most other zoning standards is that it can change over time. So someone could have asked a week ago if they met their saturation limit and they were fine. But if their neighbor gets their ADU approved and suddenly they're over the saturation limit, then they're prohibited from having an ADU. So it's something that's kind of a moving target. We also, as part of that evaluation, we analyzed the hundreds of tickets that come in related to ADUs, and the majority of those are related to saturation limits. So I think it's something that is very confusing for the public to understand what that rule is and how it applies to their property. And just kind of a good example is that top right one, that we would like to consider an ADU over the garage of our home, but we need to confirm that the location is not saturated first. How do we do that without submitting a whole application and paying for the fee? We get so many of those questions throughout the year with people inquiring about the saturation limit. I mentioned that a lot of other cities rely on those kind of form and bulk standards, design standards to ensure that ADUs can fit into an existing neighborhood. And this is just a graphic that shows you all of the different standards that apply to an ADU in Boulder. They're kind of broken into what applies to the principal structure versus the accessory structure versus both. But we have maximum heights, setbacks, floor air ratios, building coverage. We have a side yard bulk plane, which is essentially a line that comes up from the setback and then goes in at an angle, and the building can't protrude through that. We have a maximum length of a wall before it has to be articulated. All of these things that are part of our compatible design standards. And then everything in yellow is related to an accessory structure or an ADU. So more setbacks, separation, the maximum building coverage in a rear yard, how it relates to the principal size or the principal coverage, maximum height for ADUs, minimum lot size, owner occupancy, the occupancy limits. An attached unit has to have a screen side entrance. Open space is required for a detached ADU, maintaining interior connections. All of these to say that we have a number of existing zoning standards that are intended to ensure that the ADUs are compatible with their neighboring properties and neighborhood. All right, now I'm finally done. The first question is related for you all to discuss, and I'm happy to also answer any questions that you might have of me at this point, but the first question is whether you have any comments related to the proposed elimination of the 20% saturation limit in RL1 and RL2 zoning districts.
These are comments from individuals of HAB, right? Like,
Yeah, you're
we
asking
don't-
for have comments just to clarify that. So
I mean,
any
no,
comment?
well, sorry, that's not.
No, that's a good question.
I'm 100% behind elimination of the saturation requirements. I think it's entirely arbitrary with the 300 feet and where something's located. And there are going to be some communities where ADUs are more welcome or work better for the people in that community. To have that sort of arbitrary constraint, I think, is just bad policy. I am interested in the whole notion of how we regulate the externalities, and I appreciate, the planning board bringing that up, and I think that's probably a concern from the community that can be addressed. I think you got to be very careful that you don't 6 of one, half dozen the other and start talking about the externalities in terms of a saturation limit, but that said, I think there are a lot better ways to deal with overuse and particularly abuse. I mean, a lot of what I hear about the concerns of the ADUs, and I guess is a little bit of a tangential, but deal with the abuse or when they're not used appropriately. And that's something where certainly I think regulations can be put in place to deal with that particular issue rather than put a block in place for having them established. You can make sure that things are done appropriately once they are established. So I'm absolutely in support of eliminating the saturation limit. And I've dealt with many jurisdictions, including when I worked for local government entities where we've actually removed the saturation limit. In Summit County, we had a pretty significant saturation limit and we removed it because what would happen is, just like I was saying, there were certain communities where a lot of people wanted to have ADUs, and it's good for the homeowner too, a lot of times, because it helps them carry the costs of very expensive housing, taxes, et cetera. So we removed that because it really wasn't accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish, and it yielded as a unfortunate sort in a lot of circumstances. So I'm all for taking them out.
Terry, please.
Yeah. Just so I understand, we're talking about eliminating the 20% saturation limit, so there's no saturation limit, or increasing it to 40 or 50.
No, it'd be eliminating it entirely.
Everything Danny said.
Thank you, Julian.
Well, Lisa, one of my questions was, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that Seattle had repealed their saturation limit. Do you have any statistics or ideas of how that went afterwards?
No, I need to do some further digging. I just found that this afternoon. So yeah, I was going to reach out to their staff and see if there's any history that I can find about that.
Okay, cool. As for that, I'm behind it. The only thing I'm worried about is because the last time you changed the saturation limit, it was only a 10% hike, and now you're taking like a whole 80% and giving that to the community. I'm wondering if everything is gonna like really hike up the ADU, I guess, production development, or is it gonna be more gradual? I would say probably more gradual, since there's still a few things to work around, but I guess that was just my first thought, and from increasing from 20% to 100, but otherwise I am for it.
Phil, do you have a comment or a question?
I hope that eliminating the saturation limit will massively hike up the amount of ADUs that are built in the city. So that's not a concern of mine, but the thing that I've been kind of mulling over is the comment from the public, Lisa Spalding's comment about the specific neighborhoods near the university being adversely affected by this. And I remember there's been a few letters from a couple of those neighborhood associations. I'm blanking on the name of one of the ones that we saw this past fall, but one of the things that was curious to me about this argument is what I remember from the presentation in September and looking at the map of where the ADUs were. It looked like there were actually very few ADUs listed in Goss Grove and in Martin Acres and on University Hill. And so I was kind of like, maybe this concern about ADUs, already ruining things is overblown. But then Lisa Spalding brought up, I think she said something about the fact that there's some non-conforming buildings that are counted into the calculation of saturation limits. And I didn't quite follow all of that. Are there more ADUs than what the map says? Or is there actually just very few ADUs in these three neighborhoods?
So just on the point of the non-conforming uses, so in the saturation limit, when we do the calculation, it includes other ADUs, but also if there's like a non-conforming duplex or any kind of non-conforming structure, that also counts towards that, or a co-op. So that I think, and especially in the University Hill area, there are non-conforming structures, as the commenter mentioned. And so that plays into the saturation limit there. And I think we did some analysis, and most of the properties that are on the waiting list are actually in the University Hill area. They're blocked
And
by
so
the.
if you had a non-conforming duplex, I mean, the likelihood that someone would actually like apply for an ADU for that property seems like it would just get rejected, right? So
Well-
you'd still have to like, if this saturation limit is eliminated, you're still gonna have to have a single family home with a lot that everything complies.
Yeah, exactly. So you can only have an ADU on a single family home. So those non-conforming duplexes would not be allowed to add an extra unit through adding an ADU. One other kind of interesting quirk is that in our higher density districts where we have higher density, there's actually not a saturation limit.
Oh, so does University Hill have a saturation limit now?
Well, it does in the areas that are low density, but
I
there
see.
are parts of University Hill that have higher density, and then they don't have that saturation limit.
Okay, yeah, so, I mean, to me, the thought experiment that I have is like, okay, for those low density areas that the saturation limit would be removed from, what's, from Lisa Spalding's point of view, what's the worst case scenario of the number of ADUs that could get built? And would that be anything comparable to the sort of density she was talking about on the 800 block of 11th Street? Or is she just kind of kicking the cat, so to speak?
I mean, I think that it's definitely a valid concern. And I understand where she's coming from and where the group is coming from. We'd probably have to do some analysis on how many single family parcels there are in those neighborhoods that would be eligible for an ADU, and what kind of like how many units that would actually add. Certainly if it's a block with already 100 occupancy or something like that, the 2 people in an ADU perhaps might not be as much of an impact as it might be in other places, but we could do some data analysis to try to understand how many properties would actually be eligible for an ADU if we eliminated the saturation limit.
Okay, I'm just trying not to be tone deaf to her complaint, but it falls pretty flat for me that this is going to be a major negative impact on those neighborhoods. But otherwise, I just want to say I'm super excited about the saturation limit being eliminated. It seems, one thing is if you were going to carve out specific neighborhoods to not lift the saturation limit, it seems to me that maybe it's possible to cook up a saturation limit that is easily calculated in your home office rather than having to go through city staff. I mean, I can imagine that instead of having a 300-foot radius, it might be worded in language of the 10 nearest houses, or something where you could actually just pencil it out and have confidence that you would know if the saturation limit was hit for your ADU. So to me, it seems like if you're going to carve out neighborhoods, let's at least not eliminate. Let's still go ahead and eliminate the perceived barrier that's been discussed so many times.
Thank you.
Lisa, you've done the study of the peer communities, the 34 communities that don't have saturation limits, but do any of those exempt neighborhoods that might be feeling stress from, bad neighbors, no parking, all the usual suspects of things that can go wrong, that can be, annoying and make a neighborhood less livable? Those are all real, but any community that generally has no saturation limits with exemptions for certain areas. Have you seen that at all?
I'm going through the matrix trying to refresh my memory, but I don't remember any specific neighborhoods being carved out. Certainly there are cities that, like Boulder does, we only allow it in some residential districts, but not all. So there's some limitations that way. But I don't remember seeing like specific neighborhoods. But we could dig back in and see if maybe there was some nuance there that wasn't put into the matrix.
I'm sure the folks in the neighborhoods that have concerns would like to hear that information if it can be made available. So thank you.
Yeah.
And then another issue that came up, and this is not strictly about saturation limits, but it's more about potential abuses. I've heard at several public meetings, people say, oh, ADUs are going to become a corporate entity governed by LLCs for profit. And, I've never heard of that happening. I'm wondering if there are any actual instances of this being reported or discovered in Boulder, especially.
We've definitely been receiving public comments with concerns about LLCs, and I think we actually have this on a later slide, and it is one of the clarification items that we want to take care of with this update. There are definitely some opportunities to clarify whether an ADU can, or whether an LLC can prove owner occupancy or how they can prove owner occupancy. But it's not something that I'm aware of any enforcement issues or specific like enforcement action that's been taken. But I definitely think that there are opportunities to clarify the code about what we want to allow or disallow.
I actually need help understanding that whole issue. Maybe I'm hoping you can help. I guess some people are saying that it'd be possible for corporate entities to buy homes that included ADUs, run them the way like a REIT would run their apartment complex, basically for profit, and circumvent the owner occupancy requirement by technically qualify as an owner occupant, even though that's not the case. I mean, does this happen? Does this exist? Is this a real problem in any way?
Again, there aren't any enforcement issues that I'm aware of right now. We do allow if the owner can prove, because it's common for property to be owned by an LLC. Property owners of all types can own a property in an LLC to limit their liability, whether they rent something or not. So we do have properties that are owned by LLCs that apply for ADUs, but we require them to prove owner occupancy through articles of incorporation or other legal documents that prove that the owner that lives on site is part of that LLC. We have a similar process for properties that are owned by trusts or like revocable trusts, things like that, where they just have to prove that they are, I think the actual wording is fee simple owners of at least 50% of that trust or something like that. So that's how we ensure that. But I think that the issue has been raised by the public. Am I seeing hands up? I can't tell it because you guys are tiny. I'm sorry.
Yeah. He has a hand up.
No, I can say that in planning board, that concern was raised also, but the real issue was to demonstrate owner occupancy, not the form of ownership. So I think planning board came to the same conclusion that staff did on that topic.
And I guess I recommend any client that comes to me, if they're renting property, to establish an LLC to begin with, right? Even if you're just one individual, et cetera. There are a lot of different circumstances where you have to pierce the corporate veil, so to speak, in terms of ownership, like transfer tax, exemptions from transfer tax, the list goes on and on, where it's pretty easy to do because you make it affirmative on the entity to show that. The other point I want to make regarding just corporate ownership in LLCs as well is, like we talked about, the fact that despite not having restrictions on them, what we just saw is that the actual average price for the ADU is less than the designated price for the affordable ADUs. And so it really underscores the point that, hey, whoever's doing an ADU, it's creating a housing supply that would not otherwise be there. And I love to see it. And again, I'm going to go back to the whole notion. I just wanted to jump in on this because I wanted to pivot off Philip's points and some of Ms. Spalding's concerns, which is, we have two different things here. And I think it's really fundamental to take a look at those. And one is making the supply available, and the other is proper enforcement of the supply that's available and that it's not abused. And, you know, I think the Hill's probably a good example because anybody who spent any time up there, and I didn't go to undergrad here, I went to law school here, but you know, you could have 27 people living in a house, and I think Ms. Folling talked about the fact there's like 110 people in one house, et cetera, right? And so really that comes down to occupancy enforcement as much as it does the whole notion of an ADU. And it really underscores the point that a saturation limit, like I was saying, that's something that just blocks you from having the opportunity to build one. On the flip side, you can have enforcement of it. And the best analogy that I can throw out to anybody is that every single mountain community right now has wrestled with short-term rentals. And unlike Boulder, they can't really just eliminate them because it's part of their fundamental economy. But what they've all done to an entity, I mean, I could point to Telluride, Dale, Aspen, Breckenridge, what they've all done is up the enforcement obligations on the backside, because a lot of the things that we talk about with those externalities, and that's why I brought that up, garbage, noise, parking, et cetera. Those are real issues, bigger issues really with short-term rentals because those people don't live there. They're there for 2 days and they are like a tornado that comes in and leaves a whole bunch of mess in their wake. But you have that obligation that if you want to continue with the benefit of what you've been allowed, in this case, an ADU, in that case, short-term rentals, then you have to show that you're responsible for it. You have to have a designated entity that can respond within X amount of hours to whatever concerns are there. The list goes on and on. And so I really just want to underscore the whole notion of that, because I think Philip tapped right in on it, which is that if you look at the Hill, is it crowded? Are there a lot of issues there? Yeah, but most of that's enforcement. I don't think it's the ADUs that are causing those issues. I don't think the ADUs are going to exacerbate those issues. What will are abuses of what your property allowances are, no matter what the configuration of that is. If you have an illegal duplex and then you have both sides over occupied and you have 17 cars, there's going to be issues, whether or not, you know, it's got the nomenclature of an ADU, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that point. And so in terms of LLCs, you know, if they have the same restrictions as everybody else and they're enforced the same way, horrific.
I think also from a practical matter, the idea of some big bad corporate entity coming in and buying up a whole bunch of houses in Boulder just to put ADUs and rent them for $1,600. I mean, it's not very practical. You know?
Really, your mustache.
There are better ways to, you know, there are better ways to try to make a profit, you know? So I just think from a practical matter, LLC or not LLC, you know, being able to prove who lives there, whether it's an LLC that has title to it or not, is perfectly acceptable. And I think that's just not realistic. It's not practical.
My guess is there's some conflation of issues going on. And there is a national and unfortunate trend of corporate entities buying single family homes, managing them as rental properties and taking, but that's, you know, they buy cheap houses. They don't buy Boulder houses.
Right. It's again, from a practical perspective, to come into Boulder, Colorado and pay $2 million for a house and rent it for, those numbers they're not great. They're not great.
Just one other point of clarification. I believe that home reference, building reference with 110 residents, I think that was a sorority house, right?
Yes.
It's not. And by the way, I sent 2 kids through CU and they rented properties on the Hill and I was so appalled by the landlords, the way the buildings were managed, and a lack of enforcement. So I really do empathize with what's going on up there.
Oh, absolutely.
I wish the city would do more enforcement. I don't think that's our purview here at Ed, but you know, I can see there's some real issues there.
I think, go ahead.
I would think just a good question to ask might be, how many complaints do we get from legal ADUs in Boulder?
Probably not
Great
very much.
question.
I would like to ask that question. Jay, Lisa.
Yeah, so I talked with our enforcement folks and we don't have any enforcement cases in the last few years related to the legal ADU. The enforcement related to ADUs are illegal units that haven't received approval. Or people using an ADU for a short-term rental, which is prohibited. So the, like an enforcement of a parking issue or a noise issue or something like that, related to an actual legal ADU, our enforcement folks, didn't have any data for that, or didn't have any history of that.
I'm glad I asked that question.
Again, there's some practicality that needs to be applied to things.
And everybody have two things. One is I'm supposed to mention that I have an ADU, but you know. Everybody should know that.
Is it legal?
And I don't have an LLC. And the other thing is we've actually, you know, everyone knows we voted on this unanimously to remove saturation limits. I'm not expecting to entertain a motion to repeal that recommendation. So yeah, we're all for it and recognizing that, you know, anything that is enacted can have some downsides, and we hope those can be mitigated. Want to go to question 2? Does anyone have any other comments?
May I offer just another comment on
Sure,
the
absolutely.
planning board considered it. They were very interested in the possibility of some sort of zoning overlays in certain neighborhoods, and I think you've mentioned that as a consideration.
What kind of zoning overlays could you?
Which would address the whether ADUs would or wouldn't be allowed in those zoning overlays.
And which would possibly create the types of exemptions that we've talked about tonight.
That's right. So I just wanted to say that was something that planning board.
I'm not following either. What's the,
That there could be, and this would be a matter for staff to, and perhaps you're going to talk about it later tonight. I don't know.
Yeah, I think what we talked about was, you know, there could be like an overlay that could freeze certain areas of the city from any kind of change to the ADU regs. It could be like that certain areas are subject to a saturation limit because of the impacts that are on those neighborhoods, and that other areas of the city would see no saturation limit. Again, you know, it just depends on what the policy direction is from council, you know, and moving forward on the zoning tools.
Do you envision that as possibly being block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood? Like how micro or macro might that overlay be?
I mean, it could be like neighborhood boundaries. It might be something that has to be mapped and put in the code. I mean, the reason we just mentioned it is just because Lisa and I ended up talking to a representative planner from Austin, Texas on the issue of occupancy. So there were some neighborhoods that were around the university that basically those particular zoning districts that were for those specific neighborhoods didn't see an increase in the allowable occupancy when they made the change. They kind of froze those neighborhoods. So that's where the idea came up with that certain areas could be treated differently if need be. And if
to the hill.
Yeah, so
Right.
am I understanding this right? So remove the 20% cap, except for in these areas.
it could be that.
That's an option, or that's something that council is gonna, and that's something you guys, planning board suggested.
Yeah, I think we just convey that to city council if that has traction, something we can look into.
Carving out some neighborhoods, basically.
Yeah, an idea for study.
Got it.
Great. Do we want to go to commenting on question 2?
Sure. So I have a couple just background slides related to the size limit. So just to tee this up. So going back to this graphic, and just because it's a little convoluted because there's different rules for different types, but right now our attached, the limit for attached ADUs for market rate are that the attached unit has to be 1/3 of the size of the main house or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. So an example here is if you have a 15,000 square foot house, you can only have a 500 square foot ADU if it's attached. Obviously, if you're over 3,000, then you can get that 1,000 square feet. And then a detached ADU, the maximum right now is 550 square feet. This chart just, I think I showed this to you in September, but this is just going back to what we looked at in this evaluation. of that average size being 640 square feet. And then you can kind of see the differentiation in detached for affordable and market rate, because we're allowing a larger unit if it's an affordable unit. So that bottom row shows the different allowances. So market rate, like I said, is 550. If it's affordable, it can be 800. If it's a designated historic property, it can be 1,000 if that's detached. And then attached, it's a third or 1,000. And then if it's affordable or historic, it can be the half or 1,000. But what we saw in the last 4 years of data was that the detached ADU for the average size of the affordable, so the ones that were taking advantage of that larger limit, was 634. So not even maxing out to that 800 that they were allowed. And then the average size of market rate was just under 500. And then for attached, there's not quite as much differentiation, right around 800 square feet for average, both affordable and market rate.
Lisa, I'm sorry, if it's in the garage, is that considered detached or attached?
Detached.
Detached, okay.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And then one of the other parts that I think we talked about in September is that there's a unique definition of floor area for ADUs, which trips up a lot of people. So there's a lot of back and forth when people are applying for an ADU of how they're supposed to measure their floor area. So this is an example of an above garage ADU. It's right at 550 square feet. But essentially this image in the top right is all the different ways that you could measure floor area. And it actually makes a pretty significant difference when you've got these limits like this. So whether you measure to the interior wall or 6 inches beyond, which is the current ADU specification, or use that exterior wall, it changes the overall floor area that we use. So it's pretty zoning wonky about this, but essentially the more different ways that we have to measure floor area, the more confusing it is for everybody. And so one of the things that came up constantly throughout the evaluation was trying to make this more consistent, and that would help both on the administration side of it and also the applicant side. And one of the other things to consider related to the floor area is that our definition of floor area includes the egress path to the unit. So for like this unit is above a garage, and so the walkway up to their unit has to be included in their floor area as well. So that just adds some additional limits to these floor area that we think we could clarify and clean up. Regardless of the size limit, we think that this is something that should be addressed with these ADU updates. And then another point, we looked into the variances. So you can apply for a variance of that maximum floor area. It's the only variance you can apply for related to ADUs. And we had 4 of those go to the BOZA, Board of Zoning Adjustment. And all 4 of those were approved. They actually, all 4 had very similar situations where it was an existing basement they were trying to convert into an ADU. You can see the sizes range from just over 1,000 to 1,500. And BOZA approved all 4 of those variances. We have some initial ideas for what the potential size limit could be increased to. We're kind of just going back to the proposal from 2018. But this is what I'm curious to hear feedback about. What I know you all had recommended revising the size limits. So just feedback on that actual limit, but we're proposing detached at 800 square feet. As I mentioned, that was really a typical size limit in the cities that we looked at. And then attached of just 1,000 square feet straight. One of the main points when that was proposed in the previous updates was that, as you could see from that example, someone with a 1,500 square foot house is pretty limited by that percentage. And you're only really able to take full advantage if you have an over 3,000 square foot house. So in order to kind of level the playing field for the different sizes, just allowing 1,000 square feet for attached units. And the reason for the differentiation is that there's a perception that the attached units have probably less of an impact on neighbors because they're within its own structure. It's not its own structure. So that's why a lot of cities will differentiate between detached and attached. One thing to consider with the potential size limit increase is that, as we've mentioned before, there is an incentive for people to do an affordable ADU because they are allowed to do a larger size. And so if we were to increase the size, the market rate size, we would, and if we want to keep that incentive for affordable ADUs, we'd want to also increase the size for affordable ADUs. So that would be maybe a corresponding increase of up to 1,000 for detached and 1,200 for attached. So those are my only background kind of framing slides for that question, but yeah, happy to hear any questions or comments about increasing the size limit, what you think an appropriate limit might be, anything along those lines.
Remind me again, Lisa, I know we talked about this before, but on the detached ADUs of 800 square feet, does a basement space count in that or no?
In the detached?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we did talk about that. I remember
I
that.
forgot the answer.
Yeah, so if the detached, if it's above, how's that worded, Carl? It's like if it's above 3 feet coming out of the ground, more than 3 feet.
Oh, as far as how the floor area is calculated?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're talking about the ADU
ADU
itself.
itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Here's the house, here's the ADU. If this goes underground.
I mean, I think as far as an ADU is concerned, the floor area is going to be what is within the unit for them.
So including the basement.
So I think it would include the basement. The exemption for the basement in terms of floor area is more of a bulk calculation for how big the house is. But I don't think that wouldn't be the same way that it would work with an ADU.
That's my question. If you're building a house, if it's underground, the basement's underground, not above 3 feet, it doesn't count, right? Typically, does that apply to ADUs as well, or it sounds like it doesn't?
It does not.
See, that's terrible.
Yeah, so if you have, so if say you have like a common example, those properties that went to BOZA, so they were about 1,000 square feet, basement, first floor, second floor. So they were at 3,000 square feet and their basement was like 1,025 or something. So yeah, we were counting the basement in that overall floor area.
So the other comment, so that, to me, I don't think basement should count in ADU floor area. I don't know.
Specifically for the detached.
For the detached ADU. Because if you come over, you go build an 800 square foot detached ADU above ground, you have 800 square feet and you put an 800 square foot basement below it, then you have 1,600 square feet, but it's still only 800 square feet above ground. I think that's a good thing.
It's still got the 3 foot height limit for the above ground part of the basement.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's
anyway. So that's my thought on that. And then with respect to the attached 1,000 square foot limit, in my mind, I'm just thinking, you know, if you have a basement, right, that's 1,200 square feet or 1,500 square feet, and you want to turn that into an ADU, you're not adding any space. You're not adding any square footage to the existing house. You're just taking it and reallocating it, right? So, I mean, to me, like, if you have whatever it is, 4,000 square foot house and 1,500 square feet of it's in the basement, 1,500 square feet of it's in the basement, why, I mean, you just have to carve out 1,000 to make it an ADU, then you have, you know what I'm saying? That to me doesn't make sense. If it's already there, the building's already there, the square footage is already there, and you're just moving it around a little bit, why limit it to 1,000 square feet? If you're adding on something outside, different discussion.
We made that argument to council back in 2018. To say it should just be half, right?
So what, I'm sorry?
Just to say it should be half, should be the maximum. So
Existing building.
it's the existing basement. That way you don't have to carve off a portion of that basement
Exactly.
to say it's not part of the ADU. So the council basically said, well, if we did that, we want something in exchange, which is the affordable ADU.
Yeah, I like that.
Cool.
But my concern would be, you know, so it's state standards for a variance, right? So it's a peculiar difficulty or undue hardship of having a large basement. There really is none. So granting a variance really isn't as legally defensible as saying, hey, if it's there, great. And yeah, we'll let you use it. It's got to have an affordability designation. I think all the better, right? But I mean, really, that would be something where it's a little more nuanced, but you say exactly what you're saying. If it's existing square footage that you're utilizing and converting, great, then you don't have a limit. I'm supportive of the increase in the size limits. My only concern would be now if we're talking about like 1,200 square feet as far as a build on. That's the kind of stuff that might get adjacent property owners unglued, right? We're getting to a pretty high level. And I'm not sure how to thread that needle. I understand the rationale for the incentive, but I think maybe some nuanced stuff with size would be great, but I really, somebody brought it up and I think it's just something that, you kind of don't really think about till you hear it, which is the fact that if you want ADUs to accommodate families, we're going to keep talking about like, working families in Boulder. I grew up in a 500 square foot apartment for a family of 5. It wasn't fun, right? So, having a second bedroom can be aces. So I think, the whole notion of having some flexibility there so that you do have a housing stock that working families can live in is really what we're talking about here, right? So the whole notion is not having something with short-term rentals, not having guest quarters, not having anything like that, having practical housing stock in an area that's, somewhat untapped because everything else is so arduous and expensive, right? And so from that perspective, that's why I'm supportive of the size limits. I think there does need to be some nuance, but that nuance goes both ways. If it's in the basement, great, bigger, super, who cares, right? Come around, you have a separate entrance, whether it's 800 feet, 1,100 feet, it doesn't matter, you're in the basement. And
It's already there.
right, but on the flip side, you don't want somebody building a 2,000 square foot addition to a 1,400 square foot house and being like this in my ADU. So I think there's some nuance there, but I'm all for increasing the size limits and again, stopping the arbitrary constraints and just making sure that things are utilized appropriately. Those are the two sides of the balance. So.
One thing, I can just make the point in the planning board discussion of this, I think Lisa made the very interesting point that all of the exemptions that were granted by BOZA for larger sizes were to take full advantage of a basement and to avoid building those artificial walls that we're talking about. So the logic is.
It's there, right?
Yeah.
Because if somebody hired me, it's like, can we legally challenge this? I'd say, hell yeah, right? It's like, oh, your basement's too big. So, but on the flip side, who cares how big the basement is if it's there, right? What's next? You only have 3 TVs.
Sounds like the variance is pretty, it's used.
Right.
It's a real variance that is utilized.
Right, but it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's a hardship because you arbitrarily make them have to build a wall in their existing space. So I think that's the finding they made.
I like the rationale. I'd rather just say, we don't need to go there.
So my comment on this is very non-technical. I don't understand this at all, but that's just me. I'm not technically minded about these sorts of ratios. But I like the idea of increasing the allowable size because it diversifies the uses of ADUs. And one of our commitments as a board has been to look for opportunities for people that have families and maybe send kids to school to live in Boulder, that opportunities that don't exist today. So, and I think of an ADU as a small apartment for a single person, but if it could be more than that, if it could be the single parent with their kid who goes to Casey, the folks who are forming households, then we're doing something to increase the diversity of housing stock in Boulder for quote unquote families, define that as broadly as you want to. And that would be a very positive thing. As far as substantially adding to the size of the existing homes, I can see how that could raise some eyebrows among neighbors, where right now your neighbor can tear down their house and put up a freaking, jail.
Yeah, and I guess one clarification based on that point is just because we did talk about this with planning board quite a bit, was that it's not like the ADU exempts you from all of those other regulations that any, like if you could build a 1,200 square foot addition under all of those other rules from that graphic I showed, then you can, it's not any different than a 1,200 square foot ADU.
Well, and I have several neighbors who have torn down 900 square foot homes and put up 4,000 square foot homes. Like, I don't get the same about it.
South Boulder
If I had an ADU, and I'd be a lot happier.
It's not in South Boulder.
But how do we, can we comment on not counting the basement space? Is that a way to, we vote on that? How do we do that?
I like it.
Or do we?
That's why I was asking earlier about individuals.
Oh, you know, we did.
We're actually voting
Is
on.
that documented somewhere?
We're not voting anything. We've already voted on.
I think, in our recommendation.
Recommendation, yeah, we've already said, nobody needs to have an existing basement, you wanted to make it an ADU, have at it.
That's different than the detached ADU basement space.
I don't think we've addressed that one yet.
I'm wondering how common is that? How common does a detached ADU building have a basement?
Probably not.
Right now, because we only have.
It was not allowed.
You only have 500 square feet right now, so there's no sense in putting that in the basement, but if we bump it to 800 square feet, then you can put. In your mind's eye, an 800 square foot basement, also you got a 1,600 square foot ADU, and that can house a family.
What happens if you have a garage, you convert to an ADU and add a story? Like, how do you calculate it's the same thing in a way, because the garage is the existing space and the pop-up is the new space. I don't know.
So that's
How is that regulated?
that's the add-on where, you calculate the square footage, which is one of my concerns too. And this goes to something that we all talked about, we all brought up and we realized it was a little bit complex to get there, but the whole notion that, hey, if there's certain set designs, he said, this is already like almost like pre-approved or pre-stamped. Remember, we had that. One of the reasons why I understand why that's not, council's not as gung ho on that as some of the other things. One of the reasons why we said that goes to Lisa, your point that you were making regarding the square footage space, which is that, we have a lot of people that have some involvement one way or another with some of these things, at some point in their life, and it's still a little bit confounding. And to somebody who's trying to figure out, same thing as the 300 square foot thing. If you're trying to figure out where is my square footage and where is it not, is it the stairway? Then do I narrow the stairway? But then, and I think just simplifying those calculations, which I think is one of the directions that you have, I think that's wonderful. So it should be, here's my square, that fits or whatever, just make it the exterior wall for everybody, make it whatever you need to make it to make that simplified so that it's really easy for somebody to do this without having to hire lawyers, architects, et cetera, except where they absolutely need them.
You need them.
Might have gone a little too far there.
Well, architect, not a lawyer, right? Okay. Still gonna have to hire an architect. Right, yeah. That's what I said, architect, no lawyers.
May I make a suggestion?
It's made a lot of different comments, if I could attempt to paraphrase. We're definitely on board with increasing the allowable size of ADUs and simplifying the process.
I still have a comment, actually.
Please.
So one of the things I like about the current sizes is that there's a bunch of that are designated affordable, and there's a bunch that are market rate. And of those that are market rate, it seems like a very large percentage of those are market rate affordable. And as we contemplate increasing those sizes, there could be an inflection point where, this sort of like takes off like other housing prices do. And so that's a concern that I think is real.
Just let me clarify what you're saying. If it gets too big, it could turn into a luxury apartment.
Yeah, an 800 square foot or 1,000 square foot detached unit might command a lot higher rent than a 550 square
Seems like a very reasonable concern. But keep going.
On the flip side, is your point about, the kinds of expanded uses instead of just a single person, or typically more family type scenarios can take advantage of larger units. And so that actually expands supply for those other folks in the market and could be really helpful. Anyways, I think it's important just to keep in mind that the increased square footage can increase prices. One thought I had about, go ahead, Danny.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, yeah. I'm inclined to risk it because I just want more middle housing, right? And then you do have incentives in place for affordable. One incentive that I just want to like propose as something to write down for your list of future things, or maybe go in, is to just follow up with Terry's point that the basement, not counting the basement, might be a great incentive for affordable designation. So that's.
And so I think that's kind of what I was alluding to is like, so if you have a whole basement, it's 1,400 square feet. You get that whole basement, you don't have to go through the variance process, which again is kind of tortured legally. But it's got to be affordable. If you want to build a basement on your standalone, it's got to be affordable. If you want a certain size dispensations, it's got to be affordable, right? And that gives you more tools in the toolbox to incentivize people to designate that as affordable, particularly when they get larger, because I think you're absolutely right. All of a sudden people are like, hey, I can rent out, nice fancy, yes, 1,200, right? But I think if those things are in place, I think so in terms of, here'd be my suggestion, I'll just throw it on the floor for everybody. I think we're saying, or a few things. We support increased flexibility for basement use, either attached or detached. Increasing the height restriction, the size restrictions, streamlining the measurement of the size restrictions. And with all of that, the whole notion that affordability should be the tool that's utilized, that these things can be utilized as incentive for these to go towards the affordability direction. That would be my suggestion in terms of kind of what we're all saying, but that's just me.
Agree with that.
We vote on that, I guess.
Then we go on to,
You're just providing feedback to staff. Lisa's writing it down, so is Carl.
Yeah.
They'll characterize it.
don't you, Dre?
Council.
We informally unanimously agreed.
Write it down in French.
Thumbs up.
Question 3.
Okay.
We may have a really long meeting here. Try to stay awake.
All right, so question 3 is related to these clarification items. So these are things that came up throughout that evaluation as items that we would want to clarify, or there's an opportunity that these would clarify and eliminate barriers related to ADUs. So I'll just say a few sentences on each one of these on the slide. We actually already got into a couple of them, but just to explain those. And then if you see any that seem like red flags or anything like that, we can talk about those, but we don't have to talk about every single one if you don't want to, I guess, is what I'm trying to get after. So the first is extending the approval expiration period. So right now, ADUs are required to establish within 1 year. Most land uses have 3 years to establish, and it's just something that comes up a lot with applicants being concerned, especially in the last couple of years. Through the pandemic and everything, of just being able to get through the application process, get through the permitting process, secure a general contractor, and do all of that within a year to have it constructed, that people just really feel that that's a pinch for a year. So we think that would be easily solved by just expanding that to the 3-year expiration period that we have for most other applications. And that would just provide some flexibility for people to be able to fully realize the ADU after the application was approved. Secondly, is some flexibility for the height of existing structures. So kind of similar to your discussion about basements, we've run into a few situations, especially recently, of existing structures that would like to convert, like say a garage into an ADU. And while there is some flexibility that an ADU can go up to 25 feet, where most accessory structures have to be at 20 feet, there is no option if you're above 25 feet. There's no method of flexibility. So that really shuts down there's just no avenue for them to seek relief. There's no variance, there's no modification. It's 25 feet or nothing. And we do think that adaptive reuse of existing structures is probably a very low impact to a neighbor because it's an existing structure that's already there. So we think that it would reduce some barriers to eliminate or to provide some kind of flexibility for those existing structures to be adapted into an ADU rather than, you know, requiring them to tear something down and build a new building that meets that 25-foot. So that's another one of the code clarification items. We get a lot of questions. We require the attached ADU, so like a basement unit, to be separated by a lock, and it just creates a lot of back and forth between applicants, and actually several of the withdrawn applications, it was related to this standard. So we just think there's some opportunity to clarify the language there. It's kind of like 3 steps buried in several definitions in the code, but wouldn't have like a substantive impact, just clarifying the code. Limited accessory units. So I talked about there being detached and attached accessory units. We actually also have a third type of ADU called the limited accessory unit. And essentially it's a legal non-conforming duplex, but it was kind of an avenue that was added. We only have one property that's classified as that. And so we can work to figure out what that can be classified as instead, but it just adds code text, and it's not an option that anyone but this one property has taken advantage of. So that's a code cleanup. That would be getting rid of that option. And then these last 2 points, these are the ones that planning board talked about the most. And we've already talked about the AD or the LLC issue, but also related to owner occupancy. There's some clarity that would be helpful about temporary rental exemption. So right now, if you want to go on sabbatical to Germany for a year or something, or anywhere outside of Boulder County, you typically, if to rent out your house, you need a rental license. But if you're going to be gone for less than a year and rent it out, you can get this temporary rental exemption where you don't have to get a rental license. And it just isn't clear right now in the code whether that's something that an ADU owner can do, because the owner occupancy requires the owner to live on site for at least half of the year. So I think there's kind of policy direction that can go either way, and we could clarify. And so I think a question for you all as a group is whether you think it's appropriate in light of having an owner occupancy requirement. Is it appropriate for someone like the owner to be gone on sabbatical for just under a year and still be able to rent out the main property while holding on to their ADU rental, like continuing to rent the ADU? So technically for under that year, that owner is not on site, but they are returning within that year. And then finally, the public notice requirement. So ADUs have a somewhat unique public notice requirement. The only other application that has something like this is our solar access exemption, but essentially adjacent neighbors do receive a public notice that there is an ADU application being reviewed by the city. They don't have a way to submit comment. It's an administrative application, so there's nothing they can necessarily do about that. They can, and often I asked our staff planners, they said about maybe 15% of applications have somebody reach out to them with questions, but often it's just questions about what's happening. But the idea of like public engagement being meaningful, there's not really an avenue for them to submit comments necessarily that would impact the application. So we're just questioning whether the benefit of that is in line with the procedural impact that it has, because it does require multiple steps to the application process, increases timelines, increases fees, things like that, for us to have that public notice. So yeah, curious to hear any thoughts on any of these, but especially those bottom 2, I think on the slide.
Yeah, mainly clarification questions for me. Lockable separation of attached ADUs, is that currently required?
Yeah, so the definition of dwelling unit means that it has to be separated, like have a lock to separate them. So we'll often have to have people revise their plans to show like where the ADU lock is, because it's deep in the definition of dwelling unit. So yeah, just putting that in the actual ADU regulations we think would be helpful.
It's not there now. This is a proposal.
It is in the definition of dwelling unit. So
got it.
Yeah, that's why I was saying it's like 3 layers and that's why people don't know about it. Because you have to go to the definition of accessory dwelling unit, which means a dwelling unit, then you have to go to dwelling unit, and then dwelling unit means you have to have a lockable separation. So it's a bit complicated in the
I
code.
see, I see. And then owner occupancy and rentals, you have a rental license if you have an ADU. But if you did that 6 months sabbatical, you would need an additional rental license. Is that what you're saying?
No, so it exempts them from having to have another rental license, but it's just an issue that's come up with our rental licensing folks of, are they allowed to get that temporary rental exemption and rent out their main house without a license while also keeping the ADU as a rental?
So what's existing and what's proposed in this regard?
It's unclear.
Okay.
It's unclear right now how to interpret that. I think right now they would be allowed to, as how we interpret the code, they would be allowed to, but we're trying to get some policy clarity on whether that's actually what we want to be happening with the owner occupancy.
And then more generally, do any of these code issues affect the production or existence of ADUs in any way? Or they are just really about technical requirements for homeowners?
Well, these were all items that came up as issues in the evaluation, either that we heard through applicants or through staff, that were reasons, like some people don't apply for the ADU because they have the 1-year expiration period and they're like, we can't do that. Or we had several people withdraw their application because of the lockable, or like trying to figure out the lockable separation, and there were too many back and forths about that. We've had several ADUs not go forward because they're too, it's an existing structure above 25 units. Limited accessory unit is not a barrier to ADUs. It's just extra code language that would be nice to clean up. And then the owner occupancy, I think, is just a clarification issue that's been coming up a lot.
Right.
And public comments and things like that. The public notice, I think, impacts the timing of the application, which I think that that can dissuade ADU applicants because it adds time and bureaucratic process by having that step.
So each of these could have an effect of suppressing new ADUs. And then you discover this through surveys?
Yeah, so these all came through that evaluation report that was attached to the memo. So this was the result of looking at the data, we did internal interviews of all of our staff that deal with ADU applications, looking through all that inquired Boulder tickets, the customer service portal and questions we get, interviewing the people that had withdrawn their ADU applications. These were the issues that kind of rose to the top as what was still existing as a barrier to ADUs.
And also to streamline the process, like if we can eliminate a common comment that comes from staff about why your permit isn't ready to issue yet, that's going to save time and money.
Great. So I'm in favor of streamlining and removing any barriers as practical.
Me too.
John.
Yeah, I can just summarize that. I think planning board thought these were all reasonable things to deal with. The only hesitation was on the public notice requirement. And that wasn't because they thought that there should be a bigger process, but the idea was just that it's good to let your neighbors know what's going on.
Friendly.
And so, anything that improves neighborhood communications is good. So that was, I think, the only reason for the hesitation on the public notice requirement.
And I'd say in terms of the extension of approval, I think that's huge. It took me over a month to get a guy in to put in a ceiling fan. So, I mean, it's
Right now?
yeah, just like last month. So, it's one of those things, there's a reason why we have vested rights. If they've gone through this whole process, we want them to build it. They've gotten approved. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's the most important one. I agree with you on the public notice. And this is where I kind of lurch in the other direction, which is that for dealing with public process for 25 years. Giving somebody the notice and the opportunity to be heard without increasing the procedure, without having hearings, et cetera. But having somebody having the ability to write something in, writing a comment. If somebody says, well, you know, they're cooking meth in the ADU, you might want to know, and just having a means of, you know, having that articulated, right? And then if somebody wants to, if they want to appeal, they want to do whatever else they can, fine, but you're not increasing the process as much as saying we're preserving the opportunity for public notice. Who knows what you have to say? It might be a lot of the same things. It might be a lot of the, you know, not in my backyard kind of things. There could be something salient there. And I think that that part is important. And that's what I'd cautiously guard the public notice process, because I think that's what makes for good neighbors when we're all gone and they're still living next door to each other. So outside of that, I think this is all great. Extended 6 years if you need to for the approvals. But you know, the rest of it all sounds great. And I would definitely want to lock if I had somebody living on the other side.
There you go.
I
Jay, you
don't-
had something to say?
Oh,
Right, say.
we're probably gonna say the same thing. Go, Jay.
I was just bringing up baggage from 2018.
No, but not.
The public notice issue, because, you know, I tried to make, council's not going to go for it. Even this council. But I do push back on it because I think it puts staff in a difficult position. Because it creates this expectation that a neighbor can have some influence on the outcome. And they can't. It's basically
Typically,
a project.
any project that has a public notice, they usually have an appeal option. Or they can present comments to a board, you know, to call it up. And in this case, they don't. So it kind of that's the one rough part about it.
My suggestion would be, because I absolutely agree with that and I sympathize and I empathize, but I would say written comment only. It's in the record, whatever you want to do with it, you know, you have a chance to give a written comment, put it in the record, et cetera. And that's all there is to it, right? Just clarify exactly what it is. If you want to put in a written comment, here's the email, whatever, you know, have an innocuous one, adu.gmail.com or whatever. But, you know, that would be the only thing I'd say, because I do agree with your point, you know, and it can become very onerous on staff, just like having staff measure out the 300 feet, let alone the property owner. But I think just having it, just what I've seen, if you don't have a public notice process, then that's when people usually, you know, are going to carry more of a grudge, are going to, you know, say, well, I want to sue somebody, anybody, I want to sue the city, I want to sue the neighbor or whatever. So I just think having some machination.
So just to beat a dead horse here. I think it actually has the opposite effect. It doesn't create good neighbors. When talking to people who went through the process, actually, several different neighbors told me that it created this enduring tension with their neighbor because they submitted comments and they weren't incorporated. They never forgave them for it. There wasn't an actual way to do it. So, and then there's another piece, but we'll let it go. Anyway, so you can tell
We're gonna keep public notice is what we're saying. Public notice is gonna keep having it.
it is. I don't think it's a good idea, but it's going to continue.
And incorporate the word like it or lump it in the public. I was facetious. Any other comments on code clarification? Great. What's next?
All right. And I did just want to note that we already talked about the LLC issue, so that's why I didn't cover that one since we covered it at the beginning of the meeting.
Right.
Board of the corporate raiders, yes, we're good.
All right, so we'll move on. I think this is maybe the last slide. So this is outside of the actual ordinance updates, but these are changes to the process that could make some improvements. And I think we talked about this a bit in September, but an ADU is a separate application. So you have to apply for the ADU, submit fairly detailed plans, but that's not your last step. So you have to then submit for the building permit, which is a whole different round of review with more reviewers and more detail about building code and things like that. And applicants often get confused thinking that that first step is all that they needed. Why do I need to include more detail? Or they run into an issue that they didn't realize was going to be, cost prohibitive about actually building this ADU. So we think that by consolidating those reviews, that can eliminate a lot of the confusion, improve the timeliness, things like that. So that's something we'd be moving towards in the implementation phase. So once we make those code change updates, make these changes internally to our processes and how we accept applications and things like that. Similarly, it's getting late in the night. Addressing is something that came up a lot. I won't get too much into the details, but ADUs have to be addressed as a unit A and unit B, and it's happening too early in the process right now. So fixing that. And then a declaration of use is a legal document that people have to record with the county that says, I have an ADU, it's this size, and these are the rules that I'm subject to, and it stays with the property for future owners. But just making sure, we just have some things to make sure with those, that those are, as we update the ADU regulations over time, that those are still working accurately. And then finally, the fun stuff of just improving our handouts and things, self-service stuff on our website. As I've been looking through all these comparable cities, there's a lot of great examples where graphics and videos and things like that can be used to help people understand what the ADU rules are that apply to them. And we think with some of those other simplification and clarification and elimination of saturation limit, just the overall understanding of ADUs will be a lot simpler, and we'll be able to explain that a lot in a more self-service nature than we currently are able to. So any comments on process improvements?
Yeah, make them.
Yeah, I think it's great. Maybe get rid of public notice too. I'll put that one at number 5.
Precisely.
But I think it's great.
Okay. Great. Yeah, those aren't technically ordinance changes, but we still want to be informed by the boards of what process changes we think would be helpful.
I think that the one-step review is nice, but that's as long as the person knows exactly what they need to do, because I feel like it probably gets complicated after the first submission of everything, and then they might have some, revisions to make. So that's if we're really clear about exactly what is required of the accessory dwelling unit. Otherwise, I think it's a good idea.
Okay, great.
Good handouts.
Good hands up, yeah.
Good end.
Oh, quick question, Lisa. These have to be fully engineered plans, right? For a detached,
Yeah, I mean, they have to meet all the same building code requirements as.
yeah, so it's, you have an architectural team to put this together to submit it, right? Architects, engineers, structural, all that stuff is part of this.
Right.
And are you approved to build an ADU before you do all of that?
No, so that's one of the issues. That's one of the issues, is that because we have that two-step review, people think that, they get the ADU approval for the ADU application, but they haven't gone through all of that engineering and building permit and things like that. So there are often issues that come up that they weren't aware of, and that can be understandably extremely frustrating for applicants when they think that they've got something that's approvable, but it runs into different rules once they get further down the line.
Get a good design team.
Yeah, for someone creating an ATU by carving it out of the existing structure, part of their dwelling unit. It seems like obviously they got to meet the standards, but it may not be a very elaborate proposal, like working with an architect, for example. That seems pretty simple and straightforward. It certainly was for us. We had to figure out where to put the door and, certain fire codes and things like that. Is that pretty clearly laid out for folks when they go in to prepare to make an application?
Yeah, I think so. I think for a building permit, it's fairly clear what they need to have. I think it's the split between the ADU and the building permit, because the ADU application is a little more vague about, like, we don't need quite as much information because all we're checking is for the ADU standards. And so that's where the disconnect happens.
John?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is also useful is to be very clear about the obligations for someone building an ADU, whether, how they deal with utilities and metering, tap fees and power supply and heating and stuff like that. Whether there has to be a separate furnace for an ADU and all of those utilities that I think often there's a lot of confusion about those aspects.
Yeah. As I
Yeah,
recall, you make a number of upgrades or at least consistencies in your part of the house you live in, like smoke alarms and so forth.
Did you have to pay for tap fees when it's inside of your house?
No, we already had a bathroom with water and we didn't install a new kitchen sink, but I don't recall paying for a tap fee.
Careful, you're on record.
That's right. I'm sorry.
That's one of the great things about ADUs in Boulder is that it doesn't require you to get a separate tab or a separate.
It does not. Okay.
It's a big deal.
So it's accessory to your principal dwelling. Most cities, you're gonna pay a lot in system development charges.
Water and sewer.
Wow.
So I think, John, that's an important point just to make about, like, there's so many complexities of the building permit review that they don't even get to after they've already designed their whole ADU. So by putting them into that process initially, they understand the full implications of what needs to be done to bring that property either up to code or to build it to code. So they really know what they're getting into by building the ADU rather than going through the whole process of the ADU application only to be denied for the actual building permit. And I think that that's where a lot of the simplification and especially that first initial barrier of the saturation limit. If we didn't have that, then it would be a lot easier to do the one-step review.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one other thing, just to add, I mean, so keep in mind, we don't want to give the impression that this is a super simple process that any homeowner can just do on their own. You know, it's like building a house. You wouldn't expect a homeowner with no experience to be able to do that. But we've almost created that expectation for ADUs. And we're trying to be super clear that that isn't the case. You do need to hire experts to help you with it. Not a question if it's detached, right? That's just like building a whole new house.
Right.
But even an interior or an attached ADU does require a lot of technical assistance. And then we can't just basically take what you submit on the back of a napkin and basically give you a permit for it.
But I think that's the big thing. We're having that one step where you consolidate it a little so that they understand that. Because I mean, even, we're talking about basements, you're still gonna have to do a fair amount of things, I would imagine, right? To make sure, at least even just to have, some sign off that it is, structurally safe and utilizable as a separate residence.
At that point, we did make a recommendation to council that they look at pre-approved ADU plans.
Yeah,
There's still a lot of complexity, but
I didn't see that on the list.
Site work and so forth, so.
It was on no lists.
Didn't make it.
It didn't make our list.
No, it made our list.
It's on the future list. We have a future list.
Yeah.
30 futures.
That's right.
The future's only 3 years away.
I was personally hurt, but I'm over it, so.
So we get the floating ADUs that sit over the property.
Okay, any other comments? Rephrase a question there, or?
So what I would like to say to all of you guys and seriously, everybody in staff, this is a huge undertaking. And a lot of times it can almost be thankless because for everybody who appreciates and supported, there are other people who think you're ruining their neighborhood and stuff. And I know the complexities and the fragility of it all. And I just want to express my appreciation for this because Lisa, obviously, right. First and foremost, because this is daunting stuff, but it's to me incredibly important because everything that we sit here for and pontificate once a month, you guys are immersed in, but it really, I believe, can have a very significant and lasting effect to this community. And so for that, I just want to say in particular, but everybody.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that and say that one of the things that's just, that we should just keep repeating, is that there's always a political imbalance between incumbents and newcomers, homeowners and people who would like to live here. And, we're obviously, a lot of the conversation is around, worrying about how homeowners are going to react, or how homeowners are going to benefit. But I just want to point out that there's going to be a lot of newcomers and people who really need this housing that are going to benefit. And so thank you for doing this hard work. And I hope that a lot of people are blessed with places to live here in our city.
Well, I'll pile on a little bit, and thank you for your work. And, as a board, we're here to support the staff's work when they're trying to be innovative and move forward. We're not going to rubber stamp everything you present to us, but, we're going to give it a good listen and support you as we can. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for the great discussion.
John?
Yeah, just to mention briefly, and this is as much to HAB as to staff, is you mentioned briefly at the beginning of your presentation, Lisa, that there was some interest in what the impacts of additional ADUs would be on middle income housing in Boulder, both in terms of additional supply, but also in terms of potentially increasing the prices of existing housing on which ADUs might be built, and thus making it more difficult for people to move into modestly priced housing. And I think that continues to be something that is needs to be looked into. And I think in planning board, you talked about, or some folks talked about, checking with property appraisers and property managers of various types to see what the impact actually is on pricing of houses. So I think that's still important to do.
John, actually, that's a timely comment because I talked to the county assessor this afternoon and I didn't know that they could do this, but they can model all of their appraisals, or I'm not going to use the correct term, but their appraisals of all of the properties in the county, and they can break it down into the city. And they, based on their statistical analysis of market sales, there is no data to support an adjustment for properties with an ADU. So there's no statistical significance that having an ADU significantly increases the property value in Boulder County, and specifically in Boulder. There was some difference in Netherland up in the foothills, but not in Boulder.
I'm very surprised. Anyway,
That's good for
I also,
no tax increase.
I also just kind of fundamentally disagree with the concern, because I just don't see there's any path to affordable housing that goes through, single family homes, that, where we're going to figure out how to make single family homes affordable again. That ship has sailed many years ago. And I don't really feel like we need to worry about single family homes going up, because in value, they will go up in value as the land becomes more valuable that they sit on, as we increase the number of ways to use properties. When we think about rezoning, making adjustments to zoning. So anyways, I just want to state that I'm kind of resistant to the implied, maybe it wasn't implied, but it's yeah, I said my bit.
I defer to HAB.
Lisa, I hope 400 units turns into 4,000 as fast as possible. Thank you.
Lisa?
I have one question. Can I ask you a question?
Adding water.
What's the smallest ADU?
Oh, I don't actually know that.
80 square feet.
I think that I'm back to know.
Yeah, we can, I didn't pull that for the evaluation, but it'd be interesting. I could find that easily.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Thank you,
thanks
Lisa.
everybody for the
Thank
great
you.
conversation. This is all very helpful, and we can definitely, we'll bring this, we'll reflect your comments to council tomorrow. And obviously all of this will be reflected in the ultimate ordinance. So hopefully we'll come back to you with the ordinance in the next couple of months. We can talk more.
Thank you, Lisa.
Cool.
Awesome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I hope you feel better.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, bye.
Okay, we're on to item B, management of the board, zoning for affordable housing. Couple of framing thoughts. First of all, we had,
Few introductions just real quick, because I realized we didn't do that earlier. I'm not sure everybody even knows Carl.
oh, okay, well, let's have our guests introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carl Geiler. I'm Senior Policy Advisor with Planning and Development Services. I've been with the city for quite a while. I've been working on code changes on and off through all those years. I work with Lisa. It's basically the two of us that make the changes to the land use code. So I'm also working on zoning for affordable housing. We're kind of at the beginning stages of it, but I'm happy to kind of give you some background if that's helpful. So
Be very,
thanks for
That
having
would
me.
be great.
really glad you're here. John,
Don't have.
He's the authority that planning.
I bet he is. I bet he is.
Zoning for affordable housing.
And you guys all know Holly? Have you?
Holly,
Everybody met Holly?
I did the survey for the ADUs, so I was a square on the screen in September. Yeah. So here I am.
Great to see you in person. We've seen you on the screen. My vice chair, Kenny Teodoro was not here for roll call, but he is now present, as you may have noticed.
text you.
Seth. You need to introduce yourselves, or is that already know you
I just
are?
want to make sure these two, you guys know. who these people are. Keep going.
Great, let's go on to item B and. Train of thought is completely destroyed. Yeah, framing comments. This is a really big, great topic that I'm thinking Ab can dive into. And we talked about it in the December meeting. We had a really excellent guest speaker who looked at zoning reform, largely single family zoned areas in different cities around the country. And it was a very sobering presentation because not a lot of areas that have undertaken what could be considered radical reform have gotten a lot out of it. That was kind of one of my takeaways from that. Minneapolis being a prime example, when they made their changes in, I think it was 2020 or 2021, they got a lot of press and planning publications and also in the general press. Like, oh my God, Minneapolis is outlawed single family zoning. It made it sound like no one was going to have a single family house anymore. Then when you looked at the numbers that our guest speaker presented, they've gotten very little movement in the creation of new housing on single family lots. And we found that in other cities as well. So it was sobering. And it got me thinking, well, okay, we got a pretty good idea what's not working, but what might work. So let's start moving in that direction. And then to my really pleasant surprise, I knew that Governor Polis was going to make housing a priority if he was reelected. And then he comes out with a state of the state speech a few days ago, and housing is, like talks about housing, like, okay, enough, Ray. He talked about housing a lot. No, he really talked about the first thing. He came out very strong. His policy recommendations were somewhat general, but also very pointed and pointing in the direction of, the state kind of mandating certain requirements that more housing could be built in key locations. And, this is going to set up some really interesting tension between municipalities. Already has. You've seen the reaction from like the CML and the Colorado Association of Counties, concerned that local control will be taken away by a statewide mandate. I think that there's actually opportunity in that regard, and that, we're in a way where we're being given a call to attention of let's act and do something on our own before we're made to do it from the local level and then get it right, do it at the local level. So I think that the whole idea of zoning for affordable housing, I'm going to disagree with Bill a little bit because he's like, ship has sailed on single family housing and that'd be affordable. That's definitely true. If you look at, Zillow, you're not going to somehow make the houses that are for sale now in Boulder affordable. They're ridiculously expensive. But what are the opportunities to create new housing, using.
I was specifically singling out single-family homes.
I know.
But yeah.
I know, and I still think, yes, we're not gonna solve the issue of single-family homes that are not affordable in Boulder, but we can create more affordable single-family homes for some people. And we have done it in the past in Boulder, certainly through inclusionary housing. And there may be some other opportunity sites that are starting to come into play. So that's just kind of my background thoughts. And then to grease the wheels in the conversation, I sent you all individually a memo this week saying, okay, here's some ideas we can think about. And I think we should, I actually have already heard back from some of you one-on-one. I think we should talk about some of those ideas and see if they're worth teasing out and maybe developing as recommendations. I'm super not clear on the timing on this. What I heard from a member of council is they'd like to start considering some ideas as soon as next month. That seems really soon to me. But it might be better to hear from the expert before we start.
Yeah, I can.
Carl, like, what do you think?
I think this discussion is great. So, this zoning for affordable housing is one of the city council priority work program priorities for planning and development services that they set out on last year. So basically a year ago, at their retreat, they're like, we want you to do ADUs, zoning for affordable housing and occupancy. So obviously you can see ADUs has been progressed. I've not had the capacity to really start the project until recently based on other responsibilities, but I'm now starting to get into this. But council, the way they, and I'm not trying to be discouraging anyway, I'm just trying to set the frame of what they've told us is that when it started last year in 2022, they were kind of just looking for some like quick wins in the land use code where some zoning barriers to additional housing or more affordable housing could be easily removed from the code so that we could see incentives for affordable housing. And I think some of that came out of ideas that we had within our site review criteria update, which is actually going to council next week, hopefully for adoption. We had some like density bonuses that were in that, but there were some concerns from like planning board about the bonuses and some concerns that we heard internally that maybe those bonuses wouldn't incentivize housing. So we kind of stripped those out. So I think that's why it got onto council's radar, like maybe we should keep those and look at those again. So that's kind of what we're doing is we're looking at those ideas for density bonuses or maybe changes to the city's density requirements, particularly in areas where the city anticipates to see housing. Like a lot of the commercial areas are meant to be more mixed use, like the Boulder Valley Regional Center, for instance, like where 29th Street is, or the Village, are opportunity areas for more housing, or some of the neighborhood centers like Basemar, Meadows, really looking at those areas and seeing if the zoning could be tweaked to get more housing, because some of the zoning that's set up in those areas with the FAR limit and the minimum lot area per dwelling unit requirements tend to actually drive larger units. So we've heard from the development community that doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're trying to get smaller units, more of that middle income or middle housing. So that's something that we're looking at. So we're really kind of just at the beginning of that process of looking at all those parts of the code where we can see that there's barriers, and then seeing if we can remove those and see if it would either incentivize more housing, which means more on-site affordable or more in lieu going into the housing fund. So there's a number of things we're looking at where this is helpful if you have ideas right now, because this is the time when I'm trying to look for options. So as far as the timeline, we are looking to go to council on March 23rd on this particular topic. And I think they want to hear some ideas for what we could do. And then they would give us marching orders as to what to spend some time on working on an analysis and eventually doing an ordinance. And the timeline's pretty, from what we heard from council, is pretty accelerated. Like they want quick changes as quickly as possible, basically. Which it's just challenging just because I know that there's interest in the community to really revisit single family neighborhoods and potentially allowing more density. And that is a much more complicated discussion. So that to me seems like something that might happen down the road, maybe not this year, but we're definitely all ears for ideas.
Okay, that's great. I'm really glad they're here.
That was helpful.
And a good way to frame that too is, any sort of change to single family zoning is really a comprehensive plan issue. And would have to get addressed as part of the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, and you mentioned Minneapolis, like what they did from what I know is that they made changes at the policy level. It wasn't regulatory.
Right.
So the policies changed, but they have yet to actually implement it through the regulations. And I think there's a lot of folks in this community that just want the regulatory changes. And we actually can't do that because the comp plan, sets the density limits for large areas of the city. And I think there's a much more holistic outreach process that would have to happen in single family neighborhoods to get that buy-in for increased density and things like that. And there's also infrastructural things that have to be considered. We kind of went down this road a couple of years ago. If you know the Large Homes and Lots project, we were asked to do something similar, and we did a fair amount of outreach, and we ended up putting an ordinance together and outlining some of these constraints, but made some bold changes in the ordinance, and it did not pass. There was a lot of community resistance to it. But there's also like a lot of infrastructural things that would have to be considered if we increase the density in a lot of areas of the city, because some of those parts of town were actually developed with infrastructure that was only meant to serve single family homes. So we'd have to get our engineers involved and have some resources put towards is there upsizing of utilities? How do we approach areas of the city that don't have sidewalks or proper drainage for increased density? So these are a lot of things that we have to consider. But again, we're at the stage where it'd be great to hear your ideas. What we want to do is come back to have, I think there's a meeting that you guys have on March 22nd, which is like literally right before the council meeting. So we might be able to touch base then and then go to council.
Well, that's fantastic. I really thought tonight we would primarily be talking about single family lots and single family neighborhoods. But when I wrote this memo, which is just brainstorming, the feedback I got from a lot of my colleagues here at HAMP is, well, let's talk about big sites. Let's talk about, commercial areas that aren't doing well, but have not very well used surface parking. Basemart came up, for example, Sunrise Center. I would agree that those are the exciting opportunity sites, and that you might run into, shall we say, less community resistance. I have no idea what's going on with property ownership at those sites and how receptive property owners would be to, entertaining redevelopment, for example. But I mean, some of those sites are so well served by transit and central, and they're big, and they don't have a lot of complexity to them in a way when you think about a parking lot being not a very complex piece of urban infrastructure. So I'd love to hear just more about your thinking about that, and also welcome other board members to comment on this subject.
I think I heard you right, Carl, and that the council is basically saying, are there some easy changes we can make to the code to incentivize more housing that's not big, expensive housing?
I think that's how it came out of the gates.
Okay.
I think when we talked about it with council in November, there were some council members that were like trying to broaden the scope. So we're going to go to, when we talk to council in March, it's going to be kind of like, is this the right scope? Is this the right timeline? Are these the right ideas? But we're trying to just frame that single family part, because that's just probably not going to happen this year.
Because when we say housing or zoning for affordable housing, it's not zoning for inclusionary zoning housing, it's just less expensive housing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the other thing that we need clarity from council. That's actually a really big question to have, because I think there's some that have the expectation that this is purely deed restricted affordable housing, but I think there's others. The input that we got at the beginning, like last year, was I think there was an openness to just more modest sized housing.
Exactly. I mean, without getting into too much detail, there's typically 3 items in most housing zonings that restrict what you can do, and it's minimum lot size, it's minimum open space, and it's FAR, right? Those are the three, every zoning I've ever looked at, it's one of those gets you. One of those makes it so you can't do more.
What was the third one, Terry?
It's minimum lot size. So you have to have 7,000 square feet lot per dwelling unit, right? Minimum open space. Every unit on that lot has to have 6,000 square feet of open space. And the other one is FAR, floor area ratio, where they take the size of the lot and they apply a percentage to it, and that's as much building as you can build. But is it okay if I give one quick example of something I just dealt with like 4 days ago? Imagine this table is a lot, okay, within a stone's throw of it. So RMX X1 zone, it doesn't matter, it's a zone. There's a 1,000 square foot house sitting right up in front. The rest of this is like a football field. It's a very long, narrow lot. The zoning says the intention is to have multiple units or duplexes or townhomes or more than one. That's the premise behind the zoning. But you have to have a minimum of 7,000 square foot per unit of lot. So because it's 10,000 square feet and you have all this wasted land, you can't have more than one house there. When very easily, in my mind, this old house could either be redone and add something else, or it could be torn down and you could add multiple. And the irony is when you're standing on the spot, you're looking up at 3 and 4 stories of apartments all around you. You know, one example, just one example of probably thousands. But those are the 3 restrictions. And if there's an easy fix, it's either reducing those, you know, instead of 6,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit, 3,000, just reducing those to allow for more housing within our existing infrastructure, within our existing lots. I think could go a long way. I understand there's political issues. I understand there's neighborhood issues. I get all that. But those 3 barriers seem to pop up every time people, I won't say me, but people look at these lots and they're like, well, guys, you can do so much more there. But no, you can't. You know, that's my 2 cents.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think another example that we've heard is like the BR zone, which is like by the Village and 29th Street. So it allows up to a 2.0 FAR, which is one of the highest FARs we have in the city. But it has a 1,600 square foot lot area per dwelling unit requirement. So what I've heard is that if you get that mass of what can fit in that 2.0 FAR and then use the density calculation, divide it, like it just automatically drives very large units.
Exactly.
So it's kind of counter to like what we're trying to do. And obviously, you know, doing something where we're increasing density on a site, if it's specified in the comp plan, a density limit, that's going to be more challenging to like change that. But there are a bunch of zones that don't have that density limit, that are areas that the comp plan actually designates for more housing. So like the BR zones and the BC zones, that's the place where we have a little bit more flexibility to make those kind of changes to get more housing.
It's to Michael, to comment on what you're saying. Unless it's like the Diagonal Plaza, you know, on Iris, everybody know where that is? The old, you know, unless it's just so bad. You know, it's really hard to take an existing shopping center and redevelop it into a lot of housing. It's hard to do that. I mean, it's not impossible. It was hard for other reasons. 15 owners or something. But it's difficult to do that for a lot of reasons. I'm not against it. I think there's a ton of parking lots all over town that could be utilized much better. A lot of them, but it's just tough to do that economically. You know, these shopping centers are typically full. They typically have businesses. They're typically paying rent. The owners are probably doing fine, you know, and it takes a pretty high level of sophistication to redevelop these shopping centers into bigger, you know, it's tough. It's just tough.
Like people that own the centers, it's not their line of work.
Well, some are, but it's just like, if it ain't broke, don't break it kind of thing, you know, a little bit. You know what I mean? It's working. It's been working forever. You know, it's a generational thing. I don't know. I mean, I would love to see, for me personally, I know we're all over the place here, but you know, the north part of 28th Street from like Mapleton to Iris, to me, looks like anywhere USA. You know, I would love for that to be very different. And I think those BC zonings you're talking about, Carl, will help that. Because that's a lot of BC zoning in there, right?
Yeah, and it's also an area that has policy direction in the comp plan that helps.
Yeah, but then we're all over. Then you go against, well, some of these strip centers have local mom and pop businesses for 20 years or 30 years, and they service the population, and then we're paring those down to build really expensive stuff, nobody likes that, and so it just goes around.
Well, I agree, there's a lot of practical matters around that, but it seems like the city could help establish some vision for these sites with carrots and sticks. You know, maybe that's how you overcome the inertia and start working towards change. There have been in lots of shopping centers redeveloped in the United States as vertical mixed use urban projects. Question is, how can we get going out here? I have a question. I hope Carl can answer it. And it's an example that I came across recently and shared with the board. How can you create what I would call more efficient land use in single family neighborhoods and lots that are, you know, not very well used? And there's this project called Whittier Corner that stumbled upon because a friend of mine is one of the developers of it, and he told me about it, and we looked at it, looked it up. And it's 2 lots, 27th and Pine. And there was one little cottage on the lot, and they managed to subdivide this into 6 lots. They kept the cottage.
Actually 5. It's actually 5. By the way.
6.
Yeah, it's 4 townhomes surrounding the one cottage.
Oh, okay. Oh, maybe the number's wrong. Wow, sorry. In any case, would have normally been 2 homes, and now it's 5. And I think it's a pretty creative land plan. They've instead of doing townhomes, they kind of look like townhomes, but they're detached. So there's no HOA, and everyone has fee simple ownership of their properties. So it's like a successful land use transition, but no affordability whatsoever. You know, the cheapest property is the cottage, which is 1.4 million. Everything else is 2 to 2.5. I'm thinking like we talked about lot splitting. We talked about allowing townhomes where there's single family homes now, but stumbling block is that doesn't really get to affordability. You know, maybe it's part of the IH discussion where you get to do 4 of the fancy townhomes and 1 deed restricted home. I don't know. It's kind of an idea I'd like to put on the table to discuss. Also get your feedback on like, how did that happen at 27th and Pine?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars. I'm trying to think of that area. There's a variety of different zones, like there's RMX 1, but there's also RH 1 zoning in that area. I'm guessing that it was probably an RH 1 site because you can get a little bit higher density, but have a scale that's more like single family.
Yeah.
In that zone, but yeah, I don't know the details of that in particular.
I mean, then it's right across the street from the new Coburn project, which had been a tire place. And is now a mixed use building with condos and Coburn's.
Yeah.
Also not affordable.
There's also a BC zone in that area, which allows a little bit more residential than a single family.
Right. So this is all existing zoning. It's not something innovative that, or PUD.
Wait, you're talking about, yeah, it's like Pine, right? Right by Pine. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. We worked on that. That's actually, that's a by right project and it's in the BC zone.
That's why.
Yeah. The BC zone, yeah, allows it, whereas like a single family zone wouldn't.
Is there, you know, guest calls a question like, do we have other BZ?
BC's business commercial. Right?
Yeah.
Business commercial zone.
Right.
It's typically what you see like on 28th Street, up and down,
Yeah,
places like
but
that.
could we have more of those?
That's rezoning.
Yeah.
That's a big.
No, that helps to hear that as an example.
Again, I see like a good side from land use and a no positive effect or affordability, but maybe it's a starting point for something.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I don't know the project per se, but I understand the concept, and I would say that yes, maybe the new houses are $1.4 million, $2 million, but isn't that better than $1 $6 million house?
It is.
I mean, so it's maybe not affordable by normal affordable reality, but in the world of Boulder, maybe we have 3 or 4 more affordable houses than one crazy not affordable house. So it's still good.
But I think if we go that route, we need to have something to cap that so that there's some residual affordability, right? So if you go from 4 million to 5 or 6, 2.5 millions, we're playing a little bit of Monopoly, right? And so, I mean, I think. So, right, exactly, right? But I mean, I totally agree with the things that you brought up, because I think those are some of the fundamental things
It's
we can take a look at, which maybe don't necessitate as much comp plan revisiting stuff, but it does beg the question of maybe there should be a comp plan effort to begin with anyhow, because my experience, even the most well-minded jurisdictions, comp plans end up being more restrictive than maybe we intended them to be. Or it might have that legacy effect after it's implemented and stuff like that. But comp plans should be all about flexibility. They were never supposed to be regulatory. They're supposed to set a vision. And if you're setting a vision, you can have to be like, this would be great too, and this would be great and everything. I always said my favorite thing as a lawyer, any project I can always do a pro and con on the same comp plan, right? Because I mean, there's so many different policies in there. But I think really the floor area ratio thing, that's a huge one, right? Because like we talked about, the bigger units get, the more they're going to trend towards, being a little more luxuriant anyhow, right? So things like that create that flexibility. To me, after all these years, it's almost like it's gone full circle, right? Because the whole notion is, I don't think we have to have density necessarily be a dirty word anymore, right? Density comes in all different manifestations, and that's one of the biggest things here is that, there's things that you can do with density that you can't do with other tools as far as incentives, et cetera. So in terms of like council saying, well, maybe we don't want to get rid of density bonuses. I really think about anything that we have, tweaking a little bit, but keeping that. The other one that jumps out at me, what I've seen a ton of jurisdictions do just in the past few years, is that a lot of affordable housing programs have set AMIs. We talked about 75%. We talked about 60% for some things, et cetera. The reality is, in communities like Boulder and mountain towns have all been capitulating on this left and right. I have a project right now. It's already an affordable project. We're saying, well, we were doing this for 100. We need 120 AMI average. And the whole notion is, if we're talking about the missing middle, 120 AMI, even 140 AMI is still considerably part of that missing middle, right? And those crazy as it sounds, it's also very true. And so I think establishing some of that flexibility with the mindset towards how is this going to increase the stock of housing that's affordable, modestly affordable, somewhat affordable, et cetera, all the way up to Whittier, we have a bunch of little minions popping up that are all expensive, but, along those lines saying, what can we utilize? Things like density, flexibility, and FAR, all the, minimum lot size, it's a huge one. I mean, that's a great example where, there's no good driving rationale for that, especially when looking at the adjacent properties. Those are the things that to me would probably be the low-lying fruit. I think that, with a lot of policies recommendations, I'm sure you guys are aware of this, so that Ghost Town Mall on McCaslin in Louisville, the Coles Mall. Well, I know for a fact that multiple developers came in and said, hey, we're really interested in doing some mixed use thing there. And Louisville was like, why would we do that? There's no sales tax, right? And so it's like, they're finally coming to the playground in like 2020 or whatever, right? But I think that's really the statewide initiative. I don't see that as an issue in this city. People are always trying to innovate, but along those lines, I think maybe looking back at some of our innovations and saying, how can we make those more flexible to keep going down the road we're going? The other one to me, I'll probably get beat up when I look to my car for this, but in terms of inclusionary zoning, so if someone's doing a full tear down, and I don't know that it applies now, right? So if I buy a house, self-builder, like I said, see it all the time, right? So someone buys the 822 square foot house with the, refrigerator from 1981. And they're not there, it's a lot of times it's outside money. They're not there to move into it. It gets bulldozed before they ever move in there. And You know, I know that, so in Summit County, we implemented a impact fee that's not, you know, vector math, it's exponential. So the bigger your house gets, or when you're doing, or what percentage are you doing a tear down on, right? Are you doing, you know, 40% tear down, you're just building a bedroom, we don't want to touch that, right? But if you're doing a full tear down, you know, how can we extend, you know, inclusionary zoning to that as well if we haven't? And that, you know, I apologize, we are. There is.
So Danny, we're gonna talk about that next week. So on the 31st. Yeah, we're gonna spend 2+ hours on that. So just to be clear, so that's inclusionary zoning.
Yeah.
Carl was talking about regular zoning.
Right.
So try to focus on that.
Well, I'm really intrigued.
If we could tweak some of the zones and just make it a little less restrictive, you know. Reduce some of the open, and an open, not open space like county, but open space requirements on a lot.
Yeah.
Increase minimum lot size. The other thing you were talking about, the 1,600 square feet, I've run up against that in a few spots. You know, those are easy things to do that I think you will see benefit from by changing those, and not even changing them hugely, just a little bit, you know?
I mean, most of our zoning districts don't have a density limit. It's really just a factor of how you meet in your parking and your landscaping and your open space and your FAR. The ones with the density limits, you know, can deter development in certain areas where development is anticipated. So that's what we're looking at, is the zones that don't have those caps in the BVCP, and then we could actually make them like other zones.
Yep. I mean, take RL2, right? Minimum open space requirement, 6,000 square feet. Right, RL2. This is a zoning that's supposed to incentivize duplexes, townhomes, row homes. But you have to have 6,000 square feet of land per every unit. So what does that incentivize you to do? Build big units. Right, and have less of them, which typically bigger is more. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but that's the area where we butt up against that wall and we have to, that's a much bigger process.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you know.
So I'm really intrigued by this direction, you know, like changing the comp plan's a bigger deal, even though the comp plan update is coming up fairly soon. But like, what could you do incrementally, especially in these areas that are more transitional, that maybe are ready for some redevelopment? That corner we talked about now has a lot more homes than it had, not affordable homes, but the entire place is gone. You move someplace else and the single family lot is now 5 homes. And, you know, where can we see more of that? And then maybe try to build in some affordability component without going through the onerous task of updating the comp plan, like stuff you could do quick wins soon.
Yeah, and obviously we need to write the zoning in a way that does incentivize either modest size units or deed restricted affordable. So we have to work with housing to make sure that putting, you know, as proposals are gonna actually get us something. So it's just difficult in Boulder because of the land values and reaching that point of does this even create an incentive?
Right.
So it's something that we got to work together on.
I really appreciate that. And I think when we talk about rising regulations around single family lots, that people immediately go to, oh, I live at 6th and Evergreen, you know? Somebody's gonna do that there. I mean, this is like a different thing. You have these transitional zones that could maybe stand some redevelopment and increase density, and it would be actually, you know, welcomed.
Yeah, so we're in, like I said, the ideas gathering stage right now. I'm trying to make a list of options and then forward those to council to say, you know, go like do option A, B, and G, you know, or something like that. But if something pops in your head that you didn't say tonight, just send me an email. I'm happy to start looking at stuff. So.
And what I love, because obviously you have your finger much more closely on the pulse of all this. As you're putting that together, I'd love if we could hear some of the things that, you know, that you're coming through, so we could kind of chew on that, right? So instead of, you know, starting with this big broad-based thing, say, you know, here's some of the things that we're looking at, because you know, the more we can kind of chew on that, I think the better, because I think a lot of this stuff is great, you know, but you know, there's definitely these real limitations of what you can do in the here and now, what's long-term and stuff like that. So.
I think we as a.
I have a few comments. couldn't tell if we're trying to wrap this up or not, but I have a couple things. I get a little agitated when I hear about incremental zoning changes because we have kept zoning so static for so many decades that we're in this problem because we haven't been responsive over the years to address a lot of these issues that have accrued. And I guess for my part, I want to encourage you to go big and go, do something bigger than tweaks at the margins. I like your ideas and I'm not trying to undermine that. And I also understand that you have political realities you're trying to work with. And there's also scoping issues around, doing carefully crafted regulations, ordinances. But the thing that I hate about Boulder and all cities in North America is that this is people. Yes. No, it's actually the opposite. I love the people in Boulder. I hate the cars in Boulder and I hate all the space that we give over to cars. This is a city that is handed over to cars. Most people drive everywhere for almost everything. And honestly, I'd like to have more people in Boulder and fewer cars, maybe 3x in both directions. So one of the things that's beautiful about eliminating cars is it eliminates a lot of expense. Car ownership is expensive. Infrastructure for cars is expensive. The building the stuff that you put in, the parking spaces when you build a new unit is very expensive. And to save the planet and to have more inclusive communities, we need to get out of our cars. And I would just love for Boulder to be a haven, a place where people look to say, I'm willing to move to Boulder and I'm willing to leave my car in Louisville or Broomfield or wherever
There's a wonderful Greek island. I forget the name. There's no cars allowed.
I want to go.
Golf carts. I've been there, but I forget the name. It's significant, but literally no cars.
Yeah.
No cars allowed.
Right. Well, I really love and appreciate everything Phil.
Even if he doesn't like you.
I also think that there's stuff, these are wonderful aspirational, long, we hope, short-term goals, but I think there are things we can do soon that will make a difference. And that was what my comment was about. It was not to ignore the big picture at all. I'd love it if people only had to drive in Boulder half as much as they did now. That would be fantastic.
I had one other kind of comment about, initially you brought up infrastructure and density. And I understand that, the infrastructure that's in place can only satisfy a certain level of density. That makes total sense to me. But there's a flip side to that where density is actually a much more efficient, higher densities are much more efficient with respect to maintaining infrastructure. Like the worst thing you can do is build suburban sprawl out in Erie and Brighton that you hope to maintain with a tax base. It's like, it's not maintainable. And so I just want to whenever you're talking about infrastructure and density, there's two ways to frame that. And one of the flip side is as you have more density, that infrastructure is more efficient, easier to maintain. Your tax base is more robust and, amount of tax per mile of sewage system, for instance, that whole calculation changes as you, I know I'm not trying, I shouldn't be lecturing you. You're the expert, but I just the way you framed it made it sound like it was sort of a negative thing. And there's actually a flip.
No, I think what I was trying to say was, number one, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know how all the details about the infrastructure, but we can't just upzone an area without the engineers looking at the actual infrastructure, because if the infrastructure can't serve additional units, that can't happen. So my point was more that we could do it, but it's a more longer term effort. Like there's a lot of effort that's going to have to go into assessing all these different areas of the city about how the infrastructure was built and whether it needs to be upgraded. So it's not like a quick win, I think was my point.
My last point is, I have a good intentions. My New Year's resolution was to quit streaming dumb, stupid stuff on the internet and read books, housing policy books in particular. And I'm sticking to it. I'm reading every night. I don't know. I don't feel like I'm an expert in zoning. I want to read about zoning. And so I'm committed to reading about it for whatever suggestions people might have about policy books. I'm all ears. The entry point for me is I heard a podcast called Land Matters. They had two guests, Nolan Ryan, who wrote a book called Arbitrary Lines. It's zoning, how to redo zoning in America. So that's an order. I'm going to plan to read that. The other guest was Sarah Bronin, who has two projects going. There's it's a national zoning atlas, which lets you go into different areas and see what the zoning is in different cities, which I just think is interesting. And then she's got this academic paper called Comprehensive Rezoning. So
Say again?
Comprehensive rezonings. So she's done a bunch of work in Connecticut. So they're trying to be on the cutting edge of rethinking zoning. So anyways, the podcast episode was really good. And anyways, those are my two reading recommendations.
So Bill sent these to me. Listen to the podcast, was good. I was interested to learn that there are actually 10 states looking at dealing with zoning from the statewide level. I refuse to read the academic paper, although I'm sure it's very good. We can share that with everybody, and I think it's all great that we educate ourselves because none of us are experts on everything or in many things in my case. But so yeah, let's keep sharing knowledge like that. I do want to turn back to the agenda. I thought we would initially spend more time on talking to this item B, zoning for affordable housing, because I thought time was a little bit more of the essence, but I think we have more time to do that and we can continue this conversation. As much as I know that John never goes to bed before 2 o'clock, planning board meeting night, we can probably wrap this up a little bit faster. So I'm going to propose we make this a major agenda item next month, keep going with the conversation, share ideas with Carl and others, and move on to item C, which is listening session topics. If it's okay with that, we'll.
One thing I'd throw in there is that we do that as a major item for next month, but also give us the bumpers on the bowling lane, right? Like just the limited parameters, because I want to give you whatever kind of good fundamental feedback we can for this initial step, which clearly is going to be a little bit, narrowed. And so, so that we're just talking about that stuff and not some of these other things that we were talking about that.
I may not be available for the next meeting. I think it's on February 22nd, because that was actually a meeting night that we're going to be doing a lot of outreach for these projects. So I may not be available, but I mean, you certainly can.
Could be the next one.
I can be here to help you from going off the rails too.
Yeah, just give Jay the rails and we'll stay on the rails and
It's a pretty broad topic, maybe even
Yeah.
some discussion points, like how about these 3 things?
Yeah.
Because otherwise we could go.
Well,
If you haven't noticed.
I think talking about single family lots, lot sizes and so forth is
That'd be a good thing.
very immediate.
I think
We
that's
got a lot.
great fun. What can we do with single family lots other than ADUs, which we got? That's in the bag. Yes,
Okay.
right?
Um,
Gonna be there.
Item C is listening session topics. We toyed with this one, ready for some more suggestions. I think maybe we could do a live listening session a little later in the year, maybe more than one this year, but who's got ideas on what are some good topics that we would all benefit from?
Single family zoning.
They beat me to it.
Well attended.
Yeah, really.
I don't know when, I think I've been saying this for 3 years now, but whenever we have like public here again, I mean, I think that's our big goal to kind of shoot for that whenever, we're all here in person, that's just the most effective way to listen to sessions from my experience. But I think the topics that we have that we've chewed on remain, really really salient, and we can just kind of pick those once we have that date. I mean, we've talked about things like rental, right, in the rental market and stuff like that. Things like zoning or whatever it may be, you know, we've had a whole bunch of different topics that we've discussed over the last several months. I think none of them are less important now than they were. It's just having the forum, the right forum to do it. And I just.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for your time, Carl.
Yep. I think Zoom's just not.
Yeah.
But we're gonna,
Gotta do it live.
we're gonna do it with people in the room,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So what's the practicality of that? Like, when can we do that? Is anyone?
Planning board's still virtual
Are you?
exclusively.
Are you really?
Oh, yeah, that's
How many of you are there?
Huh?
How many people on the planning board?
7.
Okay. Is it just a preference of the general board or?
No, it's staff limitations. They have, some of the planning staff haven't figured out how to do hybrid meetings.
Okay, you meet twice.
We'll train them. I can train them.
Live one I've been to in 2 years.
This is a big benefit, except for the bike tour.
Yeah.
So, but so the guidance is still. Meetings are hybrid, but the public is virtual.
Okay.
Boards can meet in person, and I haven't gotten any indication of when that's gonna change. But I think could make a
Keep
special.
keep that one on the simmer, on the warmer
I
plate.
got an idea. That I think would be really interesting. And it is about the airport. Like, I haven't really given much thought to the airport, and suddenly everyone's talking about it, and it was the subject of the guest editorials last week. And, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Denver did redevelop an airport and create a lot of housing. You know, it sounds like there maybe is some support for decommissioning the airport eventually and creating a housing site there. There's probably a lot of pros and cons to that. I think there's some costs related to that I'm not aware of, but you know, that would be a hot session. You'd obviously get some airplane advocates.
Are you?
No, but when you think about it, it's 138 acres. 130 acres of city, completely controlled. And say, this is going to be a major, I mean, it's almost like another planning area too.
I think that's an excellent idea. I was much involved in the East Boulder plan, and that was formally supposed to be included within the boundaries of the East Boulder subcommunity plan and
The airport.
the airport. And it was a subject of a lot of contention, and in fact, it doesn't deal with it at all. So that's very high profile land.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways we might approach that too, as far as the listening session, may be what areas, you know, within and Boulder or even Boulder adjacent, you know, are maybe, you know, most appropriate for affordable housing, right? So just kind of expand it a little so that you can talk about the airport, the diagonal, whatever else may be there, and just say, you know, what's there and at least just get some sort of, as a listening session, maybe there's some thoughts out in the public that, you know, that we're missing. Maybe that's one way to go about it.
I mean,
It could go off the rails pretty quickly.
I'm an advocate for ditching the airport. I'd like to hear more about it. But what intrigues me about it is it's city property.
Yeah.
And even if you pay the FAA their 100 million or whatever, like we paid 40 million for 80 acres of the hospital, you know, that doesn't sound like such a bad deal. Maybe it's not 100 million, maybe it's less, but.
I mean, so the thing, I remember.
The pros and cons.
Yeah, when I started here and we were having those conversations regarding the county property, North Boulder and Iris there, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, still, it's a one level bunker. It's a huge campus, right?
Yep.
Ball fields that I can tell you, since I coached football, we didn't even want to practice there. Cause it's like, you know. Choppy.
That's where I played Little League.
Yeah, I know. Oh, that's on the nice side of
It was still rough, it was rough then.
So, two comments. One is, I want to push back on Danny's simmer proposal. As a new board member who hasn't been to a listening session, I just want one to happen. I think it would be cool to do it, whether it's on Zoom or Maybe it would be totally lame on Zoom, but
It was.
Okay, okay. All right, well.
It's in the middle of a global plague, so.
Yeah, nobody drives.
Nobody drives.
drives, right?
I love the idea of the airport. I, as a topic, I got turned on to this through Mark Wallach's most recent city council campaign. He loves to, that's one of his talking points. And I love the idea of being able to put a much larger comprehensive neighborhood together that would meet a lot of our goals around climate and inclusion. And yeah, so anyways, I think it'd be a fun topic. I don't have, I like the idea of the single family zoning as a topic. I think whatever we do ought to kind of fit under that missing middle, which is the thing, we're trying to drive home this year. So
I think both of those.
yeah, absolutely.
Others, since we're not doing it anytime soon, we don't need to belabor this one, but
Those two sound good. For the summer.
okay, next agenda item.
So if you guys are serious, you should let me know because it would require coordination. Transportation is actually leading the community engagement on the airport.
I would say we're serious. Do we need to vote on it?
Sure. I move that we have a listening session sometime this year on the airport.
I generally second it.
I don't care. I don't know if I can second.
You can stay here.
I generally second it.
So I can now reach out to them and just vote.
What, could it be you said it was TAB or?
No, just department.
Oh, the department.
Yeah.
Yeah, could that be like a joint thing with them if they're doing it anyway?
Could do with, I don't know what community engagement they're planning specifically. So just let me find out because it's not in planning development services, it's not in housing, so.
Right.
And then the other thing I would throw out there is occupancies, another state council priority.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to focus more on it, I mean, the airport is kind of council priority, but I'm not sure exactly what's going to come out of this discussion. It's really to inform airport master plan. So before they spend a bunch of more money on airport master plan and encumber the property even more with additional federal funds. I try to gather more information.
My loose understanding is we have some kind of agreement with the FAA to operate an airport through 2035.
I don't know the specific dates. I haven't done airport planning in a while. I do know that comes with lots of strings.
Yeah, and Carl did say that was like number 3 in the list of 3
Let's
things.
have that's occupancy. Let's just talk about that. Let's get that on the agenda.
Maybe we already voted on the other one, didn't we?
Could
Could someone reread the minutes?
We have a first on the table.
amend my motion?
How about occupancy at the airport?
More people on the planes.
I guess think about it tomorrow and we'll put it on the agenda.
Yeah, let's put it on the agenda. We're not voting anything right now. Everybody's getting too tired.
Like me. Michael, you were here when these were going to like 11 and 12 o'clock.
No, never. It wouldn't happen.
I'm telling you.
I got my sleepy time tea.
Right when they started, I was like,
I'm asked. Okay, so that'll be on the February agenda, and I think we're up to item. Put my reading list on. Let's look at the minutes, I'm sorry. I think we're up to an item where we're gonna talk about next week rather, and next week. All right,
Oh, that's the Boulder Fairview game. The Boulder. I'm not gonna be here. I'm a little bored.
So yeah, I think it's me, 6A, right? Matters for staff.
But I lost my place, sorry.
I'll just jump in.
Okay.
So we talked about it. So 31st, Tuesday, joint meeting with planning board. I think you can find it really interesting. So you're going to get into the really nitty gritty of inclusionary housing and how it works. Lots and lots of detail, but I think it'll be super helpful. So the idea is this is just for you to understand the program and ask questions. It's not about what are we going to change at this point. It's just getting that basic level of information. I think it'll be great opportunity for you guys to interact with planning board, but also with our affordable housing technical review group. So, and I'll explain who they are since I don't think
Is that
everybody really knows who they
in
are.
person or virtual?
It's going to be virtual. Everybody's virtual, but please do. And the memo I think is quite good. So please do read that in advance. And if you have questions, send them to me.
175 pages.
So not having done a joint session like this before, like what is expected of us?
Yeah.
What kind of outcomes we, this is just really informational.
It's informational. You get to ask lots of questions. But it's really for your benefit.
Yeah, this is something we are really looking forward to in planning board. We've asked for it for a while, so informational for us anyway.
And it's gonna be super helpful when we do coming back and talk about inclusionary housing and restructuring how we charge cash in lieu. So that we're not incentivizing a modestly sized house to get scraped and not have to pay any IH when you build a 4,000 square foot house. to replace it.
Cash flow is going down.
That meeting time,
We want to incentivize the right size units.
I get it.
so a virtual meeting a week from yesterday at what time? 6. Great. Everybody able to make that?
No. We'll be for everybody. We'll be for everybody. Only have 2 years of Fairview left in life, then it's over. Unless grandkids go there, man.
Or you just go hang around the state.
No, I'm not there unless my kids are.
Basketball? Okay. Cool.
Is there anything else you guys need from staff? Any other questions?
No.
And then any agenda items for next month other than continuing yet again to talk about listening sessions?
Listening sessions and
Zoning.
zoning.
Single family zoning.
Really go through our ideas and zoning and flesh them out.
So you're talking about single family zoning, not Carl's project.
You know, I'm intrigued. We want to talk about.
I would try to keep them separate, otherwise you're gonna get.
But I agree with that.
Confuse me.
Separate agenda items, yeah.
Okay.
I'd like us to start working towards giving as much substantive feedback on the things that he's actually working on, because he made it very clear. It's like, this is the limited subset for right now. And I totally understand that. So I'd like, we can have a conversation about that so that we can keep it going so that the 22nd, if he were to come on the 22nd for the meeting on the 23rd, we can give him really direct and useful feedback, whatever that may be, so we can get the hell out of here and take a nap before he has to go on the 23rd, right? So I think it definitely merits its own agenda item, and then we can talk more broadly about single family zoning in terms of what we're doing. Maybe that's a listening session in the future, whatever it may be, whatever concepts come along.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between tweaking single family zoning and rezoning large commercial sites and.
Yeah.
But I'd like more background on item B there before we talk about it and I feel like we got a very sketchy overview of it tonight.
Yeah, and he's still formulating it too, so I think it'll be much more.
But he
My
can't,
recommendation, once he has something formed on paper and can share it with you, you'll have a much more meaningful conversation.
okay, but would that
Might not
happen
be
before
large.
February 22nd?
I doubt you'll have it by then.
Okay, maybe we don't need to put it on the agenda.
Or just whatever he could give, that's what I was saying, even if it's piecemeal.
I'll ask him if he
Yeah.
can provide something.
Some sort of rails, right, that we can stay on and just discuss it a little bit. Because I think what was really, really helpful today was this whole ADU conversation, because we've had it many times previous too, right? And so when the rubber hit the road today, we could really kind of focus on those things. And so I think anything that can kind of help us narrow down that focus looking towards the 22nd would be helpful.
Thanks, Philip.
Okay,
Will there be public comments at Tuesday's meeting?
No, it's a study session, just like council study sessions, no public comment, but they're welcome to attend and listen.
For the planning board meeting? on Tuesday?
It's technically a planning board meeting
Right.
and we've invited
Is the whole topic inclusionary zoning?
the only.
Okay. So we're gonna be up late. Maybe.
No, it's from you in terms of.
We'll get an overview of the history of the whole program and
How it works.
Yeah. Great.
But it's on Zoom, so I don't have to shower.
Can you shower for tonight?
Any other suggestions for agenda items for February or questions for staff? Okay, quick debrief of the meeting. So we had a good meeting. We had 3 public commenters. Excellent discussion, presentation and discussion about ADUs. I think generally affirmed our recommendations on that subject. Launched a discussion on zoning for affordable housing with Carl here to give us information that will be continued. Threw out some initial ideas for listening sessions that could prove productive down the road. And we learned about what we're doing next Tuesday, on January 31st, in a study session with planning board. And our next, so we have that meeting at 6 p.m. on January 31st via Zoom. And our next in-person board meeting is Wednesday, February 22nd, correct? Will be a hybrid meeting, as is this one. And I think we have some really good large agenda items. So it's certainly welcome to suggest more before February 22nd. Great to be with you all again. Hope you had a great holiday. Happy New Year. And I wonder if I could get a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Okay.
All in favor?
I
Yeah, the meeting went past 9 o'clock.
Oh, God.
Thank you.
No problem.
First time in a while. Ever.